You want to visit Grandma. She lives 20 miles away. That's 3 days by foot, through wolves, mud, and bandits. You might get there. You probably won't. This story stumbles through the mud covered, wheel breaking, plague spreading disaster that was medieval travel. No maps, no roads, just wet dirt. No hotels, unless you count the barn behind a tavern with a goat that bites. You'd walk for days just to realize you're in the wrong village, which has the same name as the one you were heading to. Black humor rides along every ox cart, saddle sores, exploding wagon wheels, monks screaming at rivers, and bridges that doubled as traps, plus tolls. Oh, yes, tolls at every possible point, even if no one knew who was collecting them. And if you got sick, too bad. You're on the back of a donkey now. Forever? The gilded imagery of medieval travel, often painted by romantic scribes and subsequent fantasists, conjures visions of sun drenched roads, cheerful troubadours, and perhaps a well appointed carriage trundling towards a picturesque castle. It's a vision as clean and appealing as a freshly starched ruff, promising adventure and discovery. However, the reality of medieval thoroughfares was less a pastoral idyll and more a perpetual, muddy battle against the very earth itself. To speak of roads in the modern sense, with graded surfaces, regular upkeep, and perhaps even the occasional directional sign, would be an egregious anachronism, a laughable misrepresentation that would have sent any medieval traveler into fits of bewildered mirth. Instead, what passed for thoroughfares were for the most part glorified dirt tracks, pathways worn into the landscape by the ceaseless tread of feet, hooves, and the relentless grind of cartwheels. Imagine, if you will, the noble traveler setting forth from the relative civilization of a bustling market town. The air, perhaps, is thick with the comforting, if somewhat pungent scent of wood smoke and livestock, the familiar aroma of human habitation. The sounds are of cheerful bartering, the clang of the smithy, the bleating of sheep penned for sale. This is the point of departure, the moment of optimistic embarkation. But this pleasant facade is usually shed within a mile, sometimes even less. The moment the settled ground gives way to the open countryside, the true nature of the medieval road begins to assert itself, for even a gentle drizzle, a mere kiss of moisture from the heavens, could transform these pathways into treacherous quagmires. And when the heavens truly opened, unleashing a torrent of rain, the simple act of moving from point A to point B became an epic struggle against a hostile environment. These tracks were not merely unpaved, they were essentially concessions to the earth's inherent desire to reclaim any semblance of order. They snaked, they dipped, they meandered, often following the path of least resistance rather than any logical or efficient route. After a rainfall, vast swathes of these thoroughfares would devolve into viscous, clinging mud, a substance that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, determined to ensnare anything that dared traverse it. Wheels, particularly those of carts and wagons, would sink with alarming alacrity, sometimes to the axle, effectively immobilizing the vehicle. The struggle to free such a contraption could involve hours of back-breaking labor, the application of brute force, and the liberal use of wooden planks, if any were available. And for those on horseback, the experience was only marginally less arduous. The mud could sap the strength of even the most powerful steed, turning a steady trot into a desperate, slipping scramble. The rider, perched precariously, would find their balance constantly tested, their posture a contortion of effort to remain seated as their mount fought for purchase. To be unseated was not merely an embarrassment, it was a potentially dangerous dunking into the cold, often fetid mud, far from any immediate aid. The sheer unpredictability of these routes was a defining characteristic. Unlike today, where even the most rural road might offer some semblance of a consistent surface, medieval tracks were a patchwork of varying textures and depths of mire. One moment, you might be picking your way across a relatively firm, packed earth surface, and the next, your horse could be up to its knees in clinging clay. There was no way to anticipate these changes. The road ahead, obscured by mist or the simple lie of the land, held its challenges in secretive reserve. This lack of predictability meant that what might have been a straightforward, if slightly muddy, journey could suddenly become a prolonged ordeal, testing the patience, endurance, and sheer grit of the traveler. The concept of road maintenance, as we understand it, was for the most part non existent. While some routes, particularly those leading to major monastic centers or royal residences, might have received rudimentary attention from the local lord or a nearby religious order, this was far from universal. The responsibility for keeping a path passable often fell to those who used it most, a concept that, when applied to a vast network of indifferent landowners and transient travelers, yielded little in the way of systematic improvement. Bridges, where they existed, were often precarious wooden structures, their timbers rotting, their supports weakened by age and the relentless force of water. Fords, frequently the only alternative to a bridge, were river crossings that demanded a careful assessment of depth and current, a gamble that could have dire consequences. The very act of preparing for a journey was therefore an exercise in calculated risk assessment, albeit one conducted without the benefit of modern forecasting or reliable equipment. A prudent traveler might pack extra provisions, a stout length of rope, and perhaps a small shovel, not for comfort, but for survival. They understood that the road was not a benevolent provider of passage, but a capricious adversary, capable of delaying, hindering, and even incapacitating them. The initial excitement of departure, the open vista ahead, was invariably tempered by a gnawing awareness of the trials to come. This wasn't simply about reaching a destination. It was about enduring the passage, about battling the elements and the very earth beneath one's feet. The romantic ideal of the open road is a modern construct, born of an era of paved surfaces, reliable vehicles, and readily available maps. For the medieval traveler, the road was never truly open, never truly inviting. It was a challenge, a gauntlet, a test of one's mettle. The journey was not a seamless glide from one point to another, but a series of hurdles, a constant negotiation with terrain and weather. This fundamental difference, this stark contrast between the idealized vision and the muddy, arduous reality, is the first and perhaps most significant hurdle in understanding the true nature of medieval travel. It's a realization that sets the stage for the myriad other discomforts and dangers that awaited those brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to venture forth. The initial optimism that might accompany the departure from a familiar settlement, with its predictable routines and the comforting presence of fellow humans, is quickly and often brutally disabused. As the relative stability of the village or town gives way to the untamed landscape, the nature of the thoroughfare begins its subtle yet inexorable transformation. What might have begun as a reasonably trodden path, perhaps wide enough for a cart and two abreast, soon begins to narrow, to twist, and to descend into the very bowels of the earth. The illusion of a straightforward passage dissolves with each step, replaced by the stark reality of a landscape that appears to actively resist movement. Consider the subtle, insidious nature of medieval mud. It was not the fleeting inconvenience of a modern puddle, easily splashed through or skirted. This was a deep, clinging, almost sentient mire, capable of swallowing a wooden cartwheel whole, rendering it utterly immobile. The texture varied wildly, from a sticky clay-like substance that coated everything with a thick, unctuous layer, to a more soupy, watery slurry that threatened to engulf the unwary traveler. And the sheer pervasiveness of it, a light shower, a mere dampening of the earth, could be enough to transform a passable track into a treacherous bog. A heavier downpour, however, would unleash a deluge of muddy water, turning the pathway into a flowing, albeit slow-moving river of earth. The consequences for wheeled transport were particularly dire. The sturdy, yet fundamentally unsophisticated, construction of medieval carts and wagons, while adequate for relatively firm ground, was no match for the relentless embrace of deep mud. Axles would grind against unseen obstacles beneath the surface. Wheels would lose their traction, spinning uselessly, digging themselves deeper with each agonizing rotation. The process of extricating a stuck wagon was often a Herculean task, requiring the combined strength of several men, the application of levers, and the liberal use of whatever sturdy branches or discarded planks could be found. It was a task that could consume hours, if not an entire day, leaving the travelers exhausted, mud-caked, and increasingly anxious about their dwindling daylight and resources. For those on horseback, the challenges were different, yet no less significant. While a horse possessed the inherent advantage of four legs and a degree of agility, the deep mud still posed a formidable obstacle. A horse's hooves, designed for grip, could become bogged down, its powerful muscles straining against the viscous earth. The rider, perched atop this struggling beast, had to constantly adjust their balance, their legs working in tandem with the horse's movements to maintain their seat. A sudden slip, a moment of lost footing by the animal, could easily result in the rider being thrown, landing unceremoniously in the cold, wet embrace of the mire. Even if the rider remained mounted, the relentless effort required of the horse could quickly lead to exhaustion, turning a potentially manageable journey into a slow, agonizing crawl. The lack of any systematic approach to road maintenance meant that these conditions were not isolated incidents, but the prevailing norm. There were no road crews diligently filling potholes, no engineers designing proper drainage systems. What passed for a road was simply the most beaten path, a testament to repeated passage rather than deliberate construction. This meant that the terrain was constantly shifting, subject to the whims of weather, the erosive power of water, and the passing of countless carts and herds. A route that might have been relatively firm one day could be a muddy obstacle course the next. This inherent unpredictability was a constant source of anxiety and a significant impediment to any semblance of reliable travel. Imagine the traveler, perhaps a merchant with a wagon full of precious goods, or a pilgrim on their way to a distant shrine. They set out with a destination in mind, a purpose driving them forward. But the road, this unyielding adversary, has other plans. Each mile is a new challenge, a fresh obstacle, a particularly deep patch of mud, a treacherous rut hidden beneath a layer of water, the sudden, jarring lurch as a wheel succumbs to the terrain. These are the moments that chip away at the traveler's resolve. The initial optimism begins to fade, replaced by a weary pragmatism. The open road, if it ever truly existed, is a distant, mythical concept, a cruel jest played out in the minds of those who have never actually experienced the medieval thoroughfare. The sensory experience of such travel is difficult to overstate. The incessant, sucking sound of boots or hooves pulling free from the mud, the sight of everything, clothing, pack animals, vehicles, caked in a uniform layer of brown slime, the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation that seemed to emanate from the very ground. It was an environment that demanded constant vigilance and an almost superhuman level of perseverance. The romantic notion of a carefree journey where one might hum a tune and admire the scenery was a luxury afforded to very few, and even then, only on the most exceptionally dry and well maintained of routes, which were themselves a rarity. The very act of preparing for such a journey was an admission of the difficulties to come. Beyond the provisions for sustenance, one might pack extra leather for repairing harness, sturdy timbers for shoring up a wagon, or thick woolens to ward off the pervasive dampness that settled into one's bones. These were not items for comfort. They were tools for survival, necessities for overcoming the inherent obstacles of the medieval road. The lack of standardized width meant that narrower tracks could easily become impassable with fallen branches or particularly deep mud, forcing detours that often led to even more challenging terrain. In essence, the medieval road was not a facilitator of travel, but a test. It was a constant physical confrontation with the natural world, a world that cared little for human schedules or intentions. The illusion of the open road, the comforting notion of a clear and easy path, was precisely that, an illusion. The reality was a perpetual, arduous struggle, a testament to the indomitable will of those who dared to venture forth, and a stark reminder of how much our modern infrastructure owes to centuries of development, and how much we take for granted when we simply step out of our door and onto a paved, predictable surface. The medieval traveler understood this intimately, their journey defined not by the destination, but by the sheer, unadulterated difficulty of the path taken. The initial chapters of our journey have firmly established the grim reality of medieval roads as treacherous, mud-choked obstacles. We've trudged through mire, wrestled with recalcitrant wagons, and felt the damp chill that permeates bone and spirit. Now, let us turn our attention to an equally formidable and perhaps even more soul-crushing challenge, the sheer, terrifying absence of reliable cartography. To speak of navigating medieval Europe with a detailed, geographically accurate map is akin to discussing the merits of a self driving carriage through a Saxon bog. Such things simply did not exist in the form we, in our modern GPS laden world, might recognize. Imagine, if you will, embarking on a journey with the best intentions and a carefully guarded parchment, only to discover that this map is a work of whimsical artistry rather than scientific precision. The cartographers of the era, bless their diligent, if misguided souls, were not beholden to the tyranny of accurate scale or meticulous surveying. Their creations were often vibrant tapestries, interwoven with the fantastical creatures that lurked in the collective imagination: sea serpents coiled in unmapped oceans, griffins perched on mountain peaks that may or may not have existed, and the ever present watchful eye of God overseeing the known world. These maps were intended to inform, yes, but perhaps more importantly, to inspire awe and to remind the viewer of the vast, mysterious, and often divinely ordered universe in which they resided. For a traveler trying to find their way from, say, Canterbury to Rome, this artistic flair could prove to be less than helpful. A beautifully rendered dragon might dominate a significant portion of the parchment, where in reality, a dense forest or a series of unbridden hills should have been clearly delineated. The practicalities of travel were therefore relegated to a far more rudimentary system. Directions were not printed neatly on a foldable sheet, but were gleaned from a patchwork of whispered advice, the oral histories of seasoned travelers, and the intermittent, often cryptic pronouncements of those who happened to be going the same way. Think of it as a grand, continent wide game of telephone, where the initial message, meant to guide a pilgrim to a holy shrine, could easily devolve into a convoluted tale of turn left at the big oak, then follow the stream until you hear the dog bark, but mind the old woman with the peculiar hat. She might send you the wrong way. This reliance on anecdotal evidence was a recipe for disorientation. The big oak might have fallen decades ago. The stream could have changed its course, and the dog might have been replaced by a more vociferous flock of geese. And as for the old woman with the peculiar hat, well, one can only imagine the myriad of wrong turns that must have emanated from such encounters. The stars, those distant celestial guides, offered a more consistent, albeit limited, form of navigation. For those with the knowledge and the clear skies, the ability to discern cardinal directions by the movement of the heavens was invaluable. However, medieval Europe was not renowned for its consistently clear skies. The pervasive fog that often clung to river valleys and coastal regions, the persistent drizzle that could blanket the land for days, and the sheer density of forests would frequently obscure the guiding constellations. Imagine the frustration of a traveler miles from any known landmark, desperately seeking the comforting gleam of Polaris, only to be met with an impenetrable blanket of gray. In such moments, the stars offered no solace, and the traveler was left adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The sheer disorientation of being truly lost, with no signposts, no reliable maps, and often no clear landmarks, was a gnawing, persistent anxiety. It was a primal fear, the dread of being utterly disconnected from the familiar, of having no way to confirm one's location or to chart a course back to safety. Without the ability to consult a map and say, ah, yes, we are here, and the next town is approximately this far in that direction, a traveler could easily find themselves wandering in circles, their sense of direction eroded by fatigue and mounting panic. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant cry of an unknown animal could be interpreted as a sign of danger, an indication that they had strayed too far into the unknown. The anxiety wasn't just about being physically lost, it was also about the profound existential disorientation that came with it. When your carefully planned route, painstakingly pieced together from fragments of advice and hope, leads you not to your intended destination, but to an unfamiliar and potentially hostile wilderness, the foundations of your reality begin to crumble. The world, which you thought you understood, suddenly reveals itself to be a vast, unpredictable, and indifferent expanse. The journey from point A to point B was not merely a physical undertaking. It was an intellectual and emotional one, a constant negotiation with the unknown. And when that negotiation failed, the consequences could be severe. Consider the case of a merchant, his wagon laden with valuable textiles destined for a distant market. He has been given directions by a fellow traveler who swore on his mother's grave that the shortcut through the Black Forest would shave 3 days off his journey. Confident and eager to reach his destination, our merchant turns off the main, albeit muddy, track and plunges into the dense woodland. Hours later, as the light begins to fade, he realizes with a sickening lurch that the shortcut has become a labyrinth. The trees, indistinguishable from one another, press in on all sides. The faint trail he was following has vanished, swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth. The sounds of the forest, which were perhaps initially perceived as merely natural, now seem menacing, filled with unseen presences. He consults his rudimentary map, a hand-drawn sketch on a scrap of vellum, but it offers no solace. The Black Forest is depicted as a dark, amorphous mass, populated by vaguely menacing trees and perhaps a stylized wolf. There are no markings to indicate pathways, no helpful annotations about which way to turn when all paths look the same. The gnawing anxiety intensifies. He calls out, his voice swallowed by the dense foliage. He tries to retrace his steps, but in the dimming light, every fallen log and twisted branch appears as a familiar, yet ultimately misleading marker. The carefully packed provisions, meant to sustain him for the planned journey, now seem woefully inadequate for an indefinite period of being lost. The fear of starvation, of exposure, of encountering wild animals, or worse, other less scrupulous human inhabitants of these wild places, begins to take hold. His carefully calculated business venture has devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, all because a single poorly drawn map and a piece of unreliable advice led him astray. This was not an isolated incident. Many medieval travelers were, in essence, explorers of their own continent, charting territories that remained largely unmapped and undocumented. The concept of accurate surveying, of precisely measuring distances and plotting locations with scientific rigor, was still in its nascent stages. Even for those who possessed some rudimentary understanding of geography, the tools at their disposal were limited. Astrolabes and quadrant were not commonplace items, and even with them, celestial navigation was an art that required considerable skill and favorable conditions. The roads themselves, as we have discussed, were rarely straightforward. They twisted and turned, often following the contours of the land, the path of least resistance, or the whims of local landowners who might reroute a thoroughfare to avoid their fields. A traveler might be given directions that were perfectly accurate for the time the information was gathered, only for the road to have been subtly altered or completely obliterated by a local feud, a natural disaster, or simply the slow, inexorable process of nature reclaiming the land. Imagine receiving directions that say, "Follow the river until you reach the old Roman bridge." But what if the old Roman bridge has long since collapsed, or a new, more practical bridge has been built further upstream, rendering the original instructions obsolete and misleading? The reliance on oral tradition meant that information was constantly being filtered and reinterpreted. A traveler sharing their journey might, in an effort to sound knowledgeable or to embellish their tale, inadvertently add or omit crucial details. A helpful landmark mentioned in one telling might be forgotten in the next, or a warning about a treacherous pass might be amplified into a tale of certain doom. This created a landscape of information that was as shifting and unreliable as the muddy tracks they navigated. The anxiety of being lost was compounded by the knowledge that help was often scarce. Unlike today, where a breakdown on a well traveled highway might result in a quick rescue, a medieval traveler lost in the wilderness was largely on their own. The nearest settlement could be days away, and even then, communication was slow and inefficient. The very concept of a readily available emergency service was centuries away. Therefore, the responsibility for navigating successfully, for interpreting the fragmented clues, and avoiding the pitfalls of inaccurate information rested squarely on the shoulders of the traveler. This was a heavy burden, one that weighed on the mind and often dictated the pace and approach of any journey. The emotional toll of such constant uncertainty cannot be overstated. It fostered a pervasive sense of vulnerability and a deep seated awareness of one's own insignificance in the face of a vast, untamed world. The romantic notion of adventure, often associated with medieval travel, was tempered by that ever present specter of getting lost, of succumbing to the elements, or of falling prey to those who inhabited the wilderness regions. Every turn in the path, every decision about which direction to take, was imbued with a sense of gravitas. A wrong choice could have far reaching, even fatal consequences. Even seemingly well traveled routes were subject to the vagaries of interpretation. A well trodden path might simply mean that a number of people had, at some point, followed it, but whether they had arrived at their intended destinations was another matter entirely. The concept of a main road was often fluid, defined more by common usage than by any official designation. A route that was considered primary for one purpose, say the pilgrimage to a particular shrine, might be utterly unknown or impassable for another. Consider the plight of a scholar traveling to a renowned monastic library. They might have received directions from a fellow seeker of knowledge, who himself had only hearsay evidence of the library's exact location. The scholar might be told to seek out a particular monastery, but which monastery? There were hundreds across Europe, many with similar names or founding saints. The map, if they possessed one, might depict a cluster of monasteries in a general region, but without any clear indication of which was the specific repository of the texts they sought. The journey could become a frustrating scavenger hunt, involving multiple detours to less important institutions each disappointing encounter adding to the growing anxiety and the dwindling hope of finding what they sought. The sheer lack of standardized nomenclature added another layer of confusion. A village might be known by several different names, depending on the region or the language spoken. A river might have a different name upstream than it did downstream, or its name might change entirely when it crossed a political border. Without a comprehensive and accurate gazetteer, a traveler could easily find themselves on a journey of mistaken identity, searching for a place that existed only in name, or worse, arriving at a location that bore no resemblance to their intended destination. The mental fortitude required to navigate this landscape of uncertainty was immense. It demanded not only a keen sense of observation and a good memory, but also a degree of faith and resilience. Travelers had to be prepared to adapt, to improvise, and to accept that sometimes, despite their best efforts, they might find themselves utterly, irrevocably lost. This was a fundamental aspect of the medieval travel experience, a constant undertone of anxiety that underpinned even the most seemingly straightforward journeys. The road less traveled was not just a matter of choice, it was often a matter of sheer, unadulterated confusion, a testament to a world where the lines on the map were as fluid and unreliable as the mud beneath one's feet. The romantic ideal of the open road was a distant dream, overshadowed by the very real and often terrifying prospect of being lost in a world that offered few guiding lights and even fewer accurate directions. The flickering lantern cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn timber, transforming the humble barn into a cavern of uncertain shapes. The air, thick and cloying, assaulted the nostrils with a potent cocktail of fermented hay, ammonia, and the musky odor of various beasts. This was not the romanticized notion of rustic charm. This was the unvarnished and decidedly unhygienic reality of medieval lodging for the weary traveler who couldn't afford, or simply couldn't find, an inn. For many, the barn was the only sanctuary against the encroaching night and the chilling dampness that seemed to seep from the very earth. Imagine a space that was less a refuge and more a communal holding pen for creatures great and small. The floor, if one could call it that, was a uneven carpet of straw, a pungent bedding that offered little in the way of comfort and a great deal in the way of harboring unseen residents. These weren't just passive inhabitants, they were the symphony of the night. The rhythmic, resonant snoring of a slumbering ox would be punctuated by the sharp, irritable grunts of a hog rooting through its own leavings. Above, the unseen fluttering and occasional startled clucking of hens roosting on rafters added a layer of avian anxiety. And then there were the sheep, their incessant, plaintive bleating, a mournful soundtrack to the darkness, punctuated by the sudden, jarring clang of a bell worn by one particularly peripatetic member of the flock. Privacy was a concept as foreign as a well-paved road. A traveler, clutching their meager possessions, would seek out a corner, a sliver of space carved out from the dominant presence of livestock, huddling against the cold, wrapped in a cloak that had seen better days and smelled suspiciously of the very barn they now inhabited, was the only recourse. The straw, which was meant to provide insulation, instead offered a subtle yet persistent rustling, a constant reminder that one was sharing this cramped space with creatures far more attuned to the night than its human occupants. Every shift in the straw, every unseen scurrying beneath the hay, sent a ripple of unease through the already exhausted traveler. Was it merely a rat, a common enough nuisance, or something more substantial? The very architecture of the barn, designed for the storage of produce and the housing of animals, offered little in the way of comfort or security for humans. The gaps between the wooden planks, often widened by age and the elements, allowed drafts to whistle through, carrying with them the cold and the smell of the outside world. The roof, frequently thatched with straw or reeds, was rarely watertight, and a persistent drizzle could transform the interior into a series of damp, dripping zones. Finding a dry spot was a lottery, and even then, the sound of water pelting against the roof was a constant, unsettling reminder of the precariousness of one's shelter. The presence of larger animals was an ever present force. A particularly large draft horse, its breath misting in the cold air, might shift its weight, its hooves striking the packed earth with a resonant thud that vibrated through the very timbers. This wasn't just a minor disturbance, it was a seismic event in the context of the barn's cramped confines. One had to be acutely aware of their surroundings, lest they find themselves inadvertently placed in the path of a restless beast. The danger was palpable, a constant undercurrent to the forced relaxation. A misplaced elbow, a sudden movement, could incite a startled reaction from an animal, leading to a cascade of unwanted attention. The pigs, with their intelligent, yet often malevolent eyes, were particularly unnerving. They moved with a surprising speed and a determined snuffling, their bristly hides brushing against outstretched limbs. Their contented grunts could quickly morph into agitated squeals if they felt their territory encroached upon, or if the aroma of a traveler's meager rations proved too tempting. Sharing the straw with a hog was an exercise in constant vigilance, a silent negotiation for space and survival. And the sheep, oh, the sheep, their woolly bodies were a source of warmth, perhaps, but their constant milling about, their inquisitive nudges, and their unending chorus of bleats made true rest an impossibility. One might try to ignore them, to tuck oneself away in the furthest corner, but their restless energy seemed to permeate the very air. They were like a constantly shifting woolen sea, their movements dictated by an inscrutable, flock-minded logic. The olfactory assault was relentless. The sweet, earthy scent of dry hay was quickly overwhelmed by the less agreeable emanations of the animals. The ammoniac tang of urine, the earthy richness of manure, these were the perfumes of the barn. For the unaccustomed traveler, it was a suffocating experience, a constant reminder that one was in a place designed for beasts, not for delicate human senses. One learned to breathe shallowly, to focus on the faint scent of the straw itself, anything to cut through the pervasive, unpleasant aroma. Even the simple act of trying to sleep was fraught with peril. The straw, so seemingly innocuous, could harbor all manner of unpleasantries. Fleas, lice, and other tiny, unwelcome tenants were more often than not part of the barn's permanent collection. The itching and biting were a constant torment, a physical manifestation of the indignity of the situation. Sleep, when it finally came, was often fitful and shallow, constantly interrupted by the need to scratch, to shift, or to simply recoil from a particularly pungent exhalation from a nearby bovine. The sounds of the night were a cacophony designed to keep one awake. The creak of the barn's ancient timbers, settling under their own weight or protesting the shifting weight of the animals, sounded like the groans of an ancient dying beast. The distant howl of a wolf, or the closer, more unnerving rustle of something unseen moving through the straw just beyond the periphery of the lantern light, added a primal layer of fear. The absence of any human conversation, any comforting murmur of fellow travelers, amplified the isolation. One might try to create a small bastion of personal space by piling up straw around oneself, a meager defense against the encroaching darkness and the curious snouts of pigs. But this too was a futile gesture. The straw would shift, the animals would investigate, and the flimsy barrier would be breached, leaving the traveler exposed once more. The sheer physical discomfort was compounded by the mental toll. The lack of proper rest, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being utterly vulnerable, it all wore down the traveler's spirit. Even the light, when it was available, was often a meager thing. A tallow candle, sputtering and spitting, offered a limited radius of illumination, leaving the vast majority of the barn shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The lantern, if one was fortunate enough to possess one, was a precious commodity, its oil carefully rationed. Its flickering flame was a constant battle against the overwhelming gloom, a tiny island of visibility in an ocean of shadow. The notion of hygiene was, of course, largely absent. Water was a luxury, and washing oneself, let alone the meager linens one carried, was an unlikely prospect. The traveler's clothes, already strained by the rigors of the road, became increasingly grimy and imbued with the pervasive odors of the barn. One began to feel as much a part of the animal kingdom as a distinct human being, reduced to basic needs and instinctual reactions. Furthermore, the barn was rarely exclusively for human travelers. Often, it was a working agricultural building, and the remnants of its daily toil were everywhere. Piles of manure, not yet cleared, would offer their potent contributions to the ambient aroma. Tools, left carelessly about, could present tripping hazards in the dim light. One might find oneself sharing their sleeping space, not just with livestock, but with the tools of their trade, pitchforks leaning precariously, buckets filled with murky water, or sacks of grain that rustled with their own secrets. The dream of reaching a proper inn with clean straw, or better yet, a pallet, a door that closed firmly against the night, and perhaps even a measure of privacy, became a powerful motivator. But the reality of medieval travel meant that such dreams were often deferred, and the barn, with all its pungent, unsettling, and often alarming inhabitants, was the grim, unavoidable truth of a night's rest. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that anyone could even contemplate continuing a journey after such an ordeal, but continue they must, driven by necessity and the faint hope that the next night might offer a slightly less beastly sanctuary. The barn was not a sanctuary in the comforting sense of the word. It was merely a temporary reprieve from the elements, a place to endure until the first weak rays of dawn signaled the chance to escape its odorous embrace and face the still, muddy road once more. The animals, oblivious to the human misery they engendered, continued their nocturnal symphony, a constant reminder of the raw, unvarnished nature of life on the medieval road. The clinking of coin, a sound that should have been a harbinger of progress, became instead a constant gnawing anxiety. The road, which promised a path forward, was frequently obstructed not by fallen trees or impassable terrain, but by the rapacious grasp of the toll collector. These were not the neatly marked booths of later eras, where one could at least anticipate the cost of passage. No, this was a far more fluid and often more intimidating affair, where the price of progress was dictated by the whim of whoever happened to control the particular stretch of mud and rut that constituted the road that day. Imagine a bridge, little more than a precarious collection of rotting timbers and dubious planks, spanning a creek that even a determined goat would think twice about crossing. Yet, at this vital and frankly terrifying juncture, a figure would invariably be waiting. They might be a stout yeoman, empowered by some local lord who claimed ownership of the river and by extension the right to charge for its mere traversal. Or perhaps it was a shrewd merchant who had leased the toll rights and saw every traveler as a potential profit margin, his eyes glinting with the avarice of a hawk spotting a plump field mouse. Less commonly, but not unheard of, it could be an individual whose authority was as transparent as the murky water below, a self appointed guardian of the passage who demanded the tribute simply because they could. The merchant, weary from days on the road, his cart groaning under the weight of bolts of wool destined for a distant market, would approach with a sinking heart. His purse, already lighter than he would have liked, contained the carefully calculated amount needed to reach his destination and make a profit. But here, at this wretched bridge, a significant portions of that hard-earned capital was about to be extorted. The toll collector, a burly individual with a face weathered by wind and suspicion, would plant himself squarely in the path, his expression a mask of professional obstruction. "Hold there," the collector might bellow, his voice rough as unpolished stone. "A coin for the bridge, master merchant. And don't be thinking of slipping past. My eyes are sharper than yours." The merchant would sigh, the sound barely audible above the creaking of his cart and the gurgle of the creek. He'd reach into his pouch, his fingers fumbling with the coins. The amount demanded was rarely based on any logical calculation of maintenance or upkeep. It was simply what the collector believed he could get away with. A standard fee for a cart might be a few pennies, but if the cart was particularly large, or if the collector was feeling greedy, the price could inflate dramatically. Sometimes it was a flat rate, regardless of the vehicle. Other times it was a per wheel charge, or a levy based on the estimated value of the goods being transported. The sheer arbitrariness was maddening. 3 pennies for the cart, and 1 for each of your passengers, the collector might declare, his gaze sweeping over the merchant and any accompanying laborers. If the merchant had a wife or a hired hand traveling with him, each would add to the escalating cost. The merchant might try to negotiate, to point out that the bridge was hardly worth a king's ransom. "But, good sir," the merchant might plead, his voice strained with fatigue and exasperation, "this bridge is nigh on collapsing. Surely the toll should reflect its precarious state." The collector would merely grunt, unmoved. "The state of the bridge is not my concern, only the toll. Pay or turn back." The river is deep, and the wolves are hungry. The threat, veiled or overt, was always present. To refuse to pay was to risk being barred from passage, forced to seek an alternative route, which often meant miles of detours through trackless wilderness, increasing the risk of theft, injury, or simply getting lost. Or worse, it could invite the collector's wrath, a potentially violent confrontation that no sensible traveler wished to engage in. And it wasn't just bridges, fords, those shallow crossings where one might expect to simply splash through the water were also subject to tolls. The logic here was even more convoluted. Why would one pay to cross a river where the water barely came up to one's knees? The answer, of course, was that someone had declared it so. A local landholder might claim ownership of the riverbed, and thus the right to charge for its use. Sometimes, a series of well placed stones, deliberately arranged to make the crossing easier, were cited as the reason for the toll. Or perhaps a rope had been strung across the water to aid in navigation, and this was deemed sufficient justification for demanding payment. The sheer ubiquity of these levies was staggering. One could pay a toll to cross a bridge, another to pass through a fortified town gate, and yet another to traverse a stretch of road that the local lord deemed his personal property. It was a constant bleeding of resources, a relentless attrition on the traveler's finances. The cumulative effect was to make even relatively short journeys prohibitively expensive, particularly for those carrying goods to market. The profit margin on a wagon load of grain could be entirely consumed by the tolls levied on its journey. Consider the case of the abbot of a prosperous monastery. Monasteries, with their vast land holdings and their reputation for piety, also frequently wielded considerable temporal power. If an abbey owned a significant stretch of road or a strategically important bridge, they were just as likely to levy tolls as any secular lord. The abbot, a man of God by day, could become a shrewd businessman when it came to revenue generation. The funds collected would often go towards the upkeep of the monastery, the purchase of more land, or perhaps even the funding of religious wars. But for the common traveler, the piety of the collector offered little solace when faced with yet another demand for coin. God's peace be upon you, traveler. A robed monk, surprisingly stout and with an air of quiet authority, might greet the approaching cart. But even God's path requires maintenance. The upkeep of our sacred abbey and the provision for the poor necessitates a small contribution for passage over these sacred lands. The language might be more polite, the demeanor less overtly aggressive than that of a common brigand, but the outcome was the same. The toll had to be paid, and the justification, while cloaked in religious fervor, was no less financially demanding. The traveler, perhaps already having paid tolls at secular crossings, would feel the familiar pang of depletion as more coins left his possession. Then there were the truly arbitrary tolls. A lord, perhaps bored or in need of funds for a particularly lavish tournament, might declare a certain road to be under his personal protection, and thus subject to a fee of safe passage. This was essentially a protection racket, where the traveler paid not for the use of the road, but for the promise, however dubious, that they wouldn't be robbed by the Lord's own men on that very road. The irony was usually lost on the weary traveler, who simply felt the pinch in his pocket. The toll collector's authority, however dubious, was backed by force. If a traveler attempted to evade a toll, the collector's men, often armed and intimidating, would be quick to intervene. There were stories of travelers being dragged from their carts, their goods confiscated, and sometimes even being imprisoned until a hefty fine was paid. The risk of such repercussions meant that most travelers, however reluctant, paid the demanded sums. The psychological impact of these constant impositions was as significant as the financial one. It fostered a sense of helplessness and resentment. Every toll booth, every gruff collector chipped away at the traveler's optimism and patience. The road, which should have been a symbol of freedom and opportunity, became a series of hurdles, each one designed to extract as much as possible from those who dared to traverse it. The journey was not merely a physical undertaking, it was an ongoing battle of attrition against a myriad of petty authorities and opportunistic individuals who saw the road as their personal piggy bank. The constant need to ensure one had enough coin for the next toll, and the next, and the next, added a layer of stress that made the already arduous journey all the more draining. The traveler's purse, like a leaky vessel, was constantly being emptied, leaving them increasingly vulnerable and diminishing their ability to reach their intended destination with any hope of profit or success. The toll collector's grasp was, in essence, the medieval road's ever present and ever costly handshake. The journey, even when one managed to navigate the labyrinthine network of tolls and their avaricious keepers, was far from a smooth progression. The very arteries of commerce and communication, the bridges and river crossings, could transform from conduits of progress into treacherous traps, especially when the fickle moods of nature or the capricious tides of political power came into play. These were not mere inconveniences. They were often life-threatening hazards, demanding a steely nerve and a good measure of luck to overcome. Consider the humble bridge. It might appear a sturdy testament to human endeavor, a necessary link spanning a chasm or a waterway. Yet many were far from it, built often with haste and under the perpetual strain of limited resources. Their construction was frequently a compromise. Timbers were not always of the finest seasoned oak. Mortar could be of dubious quality, and the very foundations might be laid with little regard for the long-term stresses they would endure. This inherent fragility was exacerbated by the relentless pounding of hooves, the grinding weight of heavily laden carts, and the simple, inexorable passage of time. Add to this the often neglected task of maintenance, for who wished to spend precious coin on mere wood and stone when there were more pressing matters, like the next tithe or the Lord's latest decree? And you had a recipe for disaster waiting to happen. The monks, in many instances, were the custodians of these vital crossings. Their vows of piety and service were ironically often tied to the decidedly unpious task of managing and sometimes even constructing bridges and ferries. Picture a cloistered order tucked away in their stone walls, their days filled with prayer and scriptural study. Yet, when a significant waterway lay across their domain, or when a local lord bestowed upon them the honor of maintaining a crucial passage, their spiritual duties took a decidedly practical and often perilous turn. The abbot of St. Cuthbert's, for instance, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the soft vellum of illuminated manuscripts, would find himself agonizing over the price of good, strong timbers and the wages of the laborers tasked with wrestling them into place. The funds for such undertakings often came from those very tolls that travelers so begrudgingly paid, a constant source of internal conflict for men sworn to renounce worldly possessions, yet compelled to manage them for the common good. The plight of these monastic bridge keepers was particularly acute during periods of inclement weather. A mild drizzle was one thing, a torrential downpour was quite another. Rivers, normally placid or at most a brisk flow, would transform into raging torrents, their muddy waters churning with debris. Bridges designed for normal conditions would groan under the amplified pressure. The timbers, already prone to rot, would be battered by the relentless current. Log jams, composed of fallen trees and wreckage, could slam against the piers with the force of battering rams, threatening to buckle even the strongest of structures. For the monks on duty, perhaps stationed in a small exposed toll house near the crossing, the rising water was a constant chilling reminder of their vulnerability. Imagine the scene: a merchant's wagon, laden with precious silks, approaches a river crossing during a storm. The rain lashes down, blurring vision and turning the earth to a slick, treacherous mire. The river, a murky brown serpent, has swollen its banks, its roar a terrifying counterpoint to the thunder. The bridge, a series of interconnected wooden arches, is already submerged in parts, the water swirling around the pilings with a menacing intensity. The toll collector, a friar named Thomas, whose face was perpetually etched with worry, stands at the entrance, his coarse woolen habit plastered to his skin. "Hold there, master merchant," Thomas would shout over the din, his voice strained. "The crossing is perilous. The river is high, and the timbers, they groan like a dying man." The merchant, a stout fellow named Baldwin, his face grim, would peer through the sheets of rain. He had a schedule to keep and a lucrative market waiting at the other side. But the sight of the churning water and the clearly distressed friar gave him pause. "What say you, friar? Is it passable?" "Passable?" Thomas would scoff, a flicker of something akin to resentment crossing his face. "This is no passage. It is a trial. Yesterday, a small cart lost a wheel on the third span. The goods were, well, they are now part of the river's tribute. And the ferryman, poor fellow, his boat was capsized by a floating oak." Baldwin would weigh his options. To attempt the crossing was to risk losing his valuable cargo, or worse. To turn back meant a significant delay, potential loss of custom, and the ignominy of a failed journey. The tolls, usually a bothersome expense, now seemed a pittance compared to the potential cost of passage. But even if he decided to risk it, the toll itself could be an issue. The monks, caught between their duty to maintain the crossing and the pressure to generate revenue, might even increase the toll during such adverse conditions, citing the increased danger and the need for immediate, costly repairs. "The toll is doubled, master merchant," Thomas might add, his voice flat. "The damage is significant, and the Holy Mother requires a generous offering to see us through this tempest." The very act of crossing could be an ordeal. The wooden planks, slick with rain and slime, offered little purchase for the horse's hooves. The wagon would sway precariously, its wheels threatening to slip into the churning water that lapped at the edges of the bridge. The sound of the timbers creaking and groaning under the strain was a constant, unnerving presence, each groan a potential harbinger of catastrophic failure. The wind would whip through the gaps, threatening to snatch loose objects or even topple the entire conveyance. Travelers would cling to any available support, their faces pale, their prayers whispered fervent pleas for safe passage. The dangers were not limited to the structural integrity of the bridge. The very water itself presented a formidable threat. Swollen rivers carried not only debris, but also powerful currents that could easily dislodge a cart or sweep away a horse. The depth could be deceptive, a seemingly shallow section hiding a deep, treacherous hole. And in some regions, particularly those prone to flooding, the rivers were home to more than just fish and water weeds. Rumors of river creatures, or simply the disorienting effect of being submerged in murky water, added a layer of primal fear to the experience. Beyond the immediate peril of natural disaster, political instability and localized conflict could transform these crossings into death traps. If two neighboring lords were feuding, a bridge connecting their territories could become a contested zone. Toll collectors, backed by armed men, might demand exorbitant fees or even refuse passage to those suspected of sympathizing with the opposing faction. A traveler caught between warring factions could find themselves ambushed on the bridge, their goods plundered, their journey ended violently. Even when the bridges themselves remained intact, the approaches could be perilous. A muddy track leading to the crossing could become an impassable quagmire after heavy rain, trapping wagons and forcing travelers to abandon their vehicles. Or the very act of paying a toll could expose one to danger. A poorly guarded toll booth, known to be a source of revenue, could become a target for brigands. The traveler, having just parted with their coin, might find themselves immediately set upon by robbers who knew they were likely to have cash on hand. The toll collector, even if honest, might be powerless to protect their clientele. The monks tasked with maintaining these crossings were often caught in the middle. They were expected to provide a safe and reliable passage, yet they rarely had the resources to do so perfectly, especially during adverse conditions. Their lamentations were not just about the physical hardship of their duty, but also about the moral compromises they were sometimes forced to make. When faced with the potential collapse of a bridge and the desperate pleas of travelers to cross, they might feel compelled to allow passage on a structure that they knew was compromised, praying that their faith would see them through. The fear of God was a powerful motivator, but so too was the fear of a drowning man's curse or the wrath of a lord whose revenues were being impacted by a closed crossing. The ferryman, often a more solitary and less formally sanctioned provider of passage, faced similar, if not greater, dangers. His vessel, perhaps a simple, crudely built boat, was perpetually at the mercy of the current and the whims of the weather. A strong wind could make crossing impossible, or even dangerous. A sudden storm could arise, turning the placid river into a churning cauldron. The ferryman's livelihood depended on his ability to navigate these treacherous waters, a skill honed through experience, but never truly immune to the overwhelming power of nature. Imagine a ferryman, a grizzled man named Amon, whose hands were as calloused as the hull of his boat. He was hired by a local village to provide a ferry service across a wide, deep river. The village, in turn, levied a small toll to support his services. One blustery autumn afternoon, a group of pilgrims, their faces pale and their cloaks sodden, arrived at his landing. They were bound for a distant shrine, and this river was their last significant obstacle. Amen, man, one of the pilgrims called out, his voice hoarse. Can you take us across? We have coin for you, and for the village. Aemon squinted at the river, the waves growing choppier, the wind picking up speed. It's a rough crossing today, brothers, he replied, his voice a low rumble. The current is strong, and the wind bites hard. My boat is sound, but even a sturdy vessel can be tossed like a child's toy. The pilgrims, however, were insistent. Their pilgrimage was a matter of faith, and their determination often bordered on the fanatical. They pressed him, offering more coin than usual, their eyes burning with a desperate piety. Aemon, torn between his ingrained caution and the lure of extra earnings, and perhaps a sense of obligation to those on a holy quest, finally agreed. The crossing began uneventfully enough. The small boat, carrying the pilgrims and Aemon at the helm, pushed off from the shore. But as they reached the middle of the river, the full force of the wind hit them. The waves, once manageable ripples, became violent swells, crashing over the sides of the boat, drenching everyone and threatening to swamp them. The boat pitched and rolled, its wooden planks groaning in protest. The pilgrims, their earlier fervor replaced by stark terror, clung to the sides, their prayers now frantic pleas for survival. Aemon fought the tiller with all his might, his muscles straining, his knuckles white. He knew this river, but he also knew its capacity for destruction. He saw a large log, torn from the riverbank upstream, tumbling towards them. It was a collision course. With a desperate maneuver, he managed to swing the boat slightly, the log scraping violently along the hull, sending splinters flying and eliciting a collective gasp of fear from the pilgrims. The near disaster, however, had not extinguished their resolve. They urged Aemon onward, their voices now a mixture of desperation and raw will. But the wind continued to buffet them, and the river, it seemed, was determined to claim them. One particularly large wave crashed over the stern, filling the boat with a surge of icy water. The vessel, now heavy and sluggish, began to list precariously. The pilgrims, sensing their imminent doom, began to cry out in despair. It was in moments like these that the true perils of the road, even the seemingly essential infrastructure of passage, became starkly apparent. These were not just journeys, they were gambles. Gambles against the forces of nature, against the vagaries of human authority, and against the very limitations of the world as it was then understood. The toll, whether paid to a greedy baron or a pious monk, was often the least of the traveler's worries. The real cost of passage was measured in fear, in hardship, and sometimes, tragically, in life itself. The promise of the road was ever present, but the path was often fraught with dangers that could turn even the most determined traveler back, or worse, swallow them whole. The relentless pounding of hooves, the grinding of wagon wheels, and the very act of remaining upright for extended periods without the benefit of modern suspension or padded seating subjected the medieval traveler's body to a symphony of aches and pains. These were not fleeting discomforts, easily remedied by a good night's sleep and a warm bath, but deep-seated, persistent irritations that could gnaw at a person's very well-being, transforming even the most robust constitution into a tapestry of complaints. For those fortunate enough to travel by horseback, the saddle itself was often a source of profound suffering. Imagine a saddle crafted from rough leather, perhaps inadequately padded or fitted with a crude tree that chafed and rubbed with every movement of the horse. Day after day, hour after hour, this abrasive friction would work its insidious magic. The skin, subjected to constant pressure and abrasion, would become inflamed, then broken. What began as a mere irritation would quickly develop into painful saddle sores. These were not superficial grazes, they were deep, festering wounds, prone to infection in the unhygienic conditions of travel. The simple act of mounting the horse could send a jolt of agonizing pain through the rider, and finding any semblance of comfort while seated became an impossible dream. Riders would shift and squirm, trying to alleviate the pressure, often finding that any new position brought its own unique brand of agony. The sores could become so severe that they would bleed profusely, staining the rider's breeches and leaving a trail of evidence of their suffering. The smell of the festering wounds, mixed with sweat and horse, was a constant, unpleasant reminder of the body's rebellion against the demands of the journey. Some hardy souls might try to treat these sores with poultices of herbs, or perhaps a smear of animal fat, but in the unforgiving environment of the road, healing was a slow and arduous process, often hampered by the very act of traveling. The constant vibration of the horse's gait would work the dirt and debris deeper into the open wounds, ensuring that infection was a constant threat and the possibility of a debilitating fever a grim reality. The simple joy of a swift ride could be utterly extinguished by the sheer, unremitting torment of a well developed saddle sore. Wagon travel, while perhaps sparing the rider the direct agony of the saddle, presented its own unique set of bodily abuses. The roads, if they could even be dignified with such a name, were rarely smooth. Potholes, ruts carved by previous wagons, and the incessant wear of hooves, and the unevenness of the natural terrain combined to create a jarring, bone rattling experience. Imagine being confined within the wooden confines of a cart or wagon, its unyielding floor offering no respite from the violent jolts and pitches. Every bump, every hollow, every protruding root was transmitted directly to the traveler's body. Bones would ache, muscles would protest, and internal organs would slosh about like marbles in a tin can. The continuous vibration, like a constant low-grade thrumming, would induce a pervasive fatigue, a deep weariness that seeped into the very marrow of one's bones. Joints, particularly the hips and spine, bore the brunt of this assault. The cartilage, without the benefit of modern cushioning, would be compressed and strained with each jarring impact. Bruises would bloom on limbs that had collided with the wagon's interior, and the constant pressure on the lower back could lead to excruciating pain, a dull, persistent ache that might linger for days, if not weeks, after the journey's end. Even sitting still offered little relief. The very motion of the wagon would cause the body to sway and lurch, forcing the traveler to constantly brace themselves, tensing muscles that would eventually spasm and cramp. Sleep, when it was possible at all, was a fitful affair, punctuated by the wagon's lurching and the discomfort of trying to find a stable position amongst the jostling luggage and fellow travelers. The constant motion could also lead to a form of seasickness, particularly for those unaccustomed to such prolonged vehicular movement. The stomach would churn, and a general malaise would descend, adding nausea to the already considerable list of physical torments. Beyond the general discomfort of motion, the very act of staying in place for hours on end in a confined space could lead to a host of specific complaints. Stiffness was an ever present foe. Muscles that were held in the same position for too long would seize up, becoming tight and painful. Circulation would be impaired, leading to numb extremities and an unsettling tingling sensation. Backs would ache from the poor posture necessitated by the wagon's design, and necks would stiffen from craning to see out of the small openings, or from the simple inability to find a comfortable resting position. For those traveling with their families, the close proximity could also lead to a heightened sense of physical discomfort. Sharing a confined space with multiple individuals, each with their own odors and movements, could be an olfactory and tactile ordeal in itself. The constant need to adjust for the movements of others, the occasional accidental bump or jostle, all contributed to the overall physical strain. Consider the plight of a merchant making his way to a market town, his wagon laden with bolts of fine wool. He would rise before dawn, the chill of the morning air biting at his exposed skin. After a meager breakfast, he would climb into his wagon, the wood cold and unforgiving beneath him. For the first few hours, the road might be relatively smooth and the jolting tolerable, but as the miles wore on, the inevitable ruts and stones would begin their relentless assault. His back would begin to ache, a dull throb that would gradually intensify. His legs, crammed into the limited space, would cramp, and a persistent pins and needles sensation would set in. He might try shifting his weight, leaning against the side of the wagon, or even attempting to stretch his legs out. But any such movement would only serve to highlight the inflexibility and pain that had taken root in his muscles and joints. The air inside the wagon would grow stale and warm, thick with the scent of wool, horse, and the less pleasant odors of human proximity. He would find himself constantly adjusting his position, seeking that elusive spot where the jarring was less severe, or where the pressure on his aching back was momentarily eased. But such moments were fleeting. The wagon would hit another rut, sending a shock wave through his entire frame, and the cycle of discomfort would begin anew. By the afternoon, his entire body would feel as if it had been beaten with sticks. His hands, gripping the reins or the side of the wagon, would be stiff and sore. His eyes, strained from peering through the dust and glare, would ache with fatigue. The simple desire to stand up and stretch his legs would be a powerful, almost overwhelming urge. But the limitations of the road and the demands of his journey would keep him imprisoned within his rattling, bouncing world. The sheer duration of these journeys also played a crucial role in amplifying the physical toll. A journey of a few days might be endured with gritted teeth and sheer willpower. But for those undertaking longer voyages, the cumulative effect of constant physical stress could be devastating. The body, subjected to unremitting discomfort, would begin to break down. Minor irritations would escalate into chronic conditions. The traveler might arrive at their destination not with the vigor of adventure, but with the weariness of a battlefield veteran, their body a roadmap of aches, stiffness, and lingering pains. The joy of arrival was often tempered by the sheer relief of simply being able to disembark from the instrument of their torture. Even simple actions, like walking or standing, might feel alien and painful after hours of being confined to a saddle or a wagon seat. The memory of the journey would be indelibly etched not just in their minds, but in the very sinews and bones of their bodies. This pervasive discomfort was not merely a matter of inconvenience, it had practical consequences. A traveler racked with pain would be less alert, less capable of reacting to dangers, and certainly less able to perform any physical labor upon arrival. A merchant whose hands were too stiff to count coins accurately, or a pilgrim whose legs were too weak to stand for prayer, were severely handicapped by the physical toll of their travels. The medieval road was a trial, and one of its most formidable adversaries was the traveler's own body, subjected to a relentless onslaught of jolting, chafing, and unnatural confinement. The dream of reaching a destination, of seeing new sights, or conducting profitable business was constantly undermined by the immediate, visceral reality of a body in revolt, crying out for respite from the unmaking process of the medieval journey. It was a constant, nagging, and often excruciating reminder that the human body, for all its resilience, had its limits, and the medieval road was designed, it seemed, to find and exploit every single one of them. The symphony of aches and pains was not a mere accompaniment to the journey. It was in many ways the central movement. The jolting rhythm of a wagon was the metronome of medieval travel, a cadence often broken by the sharp report of failure. It wasn't just the discomfort of the ride that wore a traveler down. It was the ever present specter of mechanical catastrophe. A medieval wagon, for all its sturdy appearance, was a collection of wooden parts bound by iron, and these components, subjected to the brutal indifference of poorly maintained roads, were prone to a multitude of disintegrations. The most common and arguably most devastating of these was the failure of a wheel. Imagine the scene. Miles from the nearest village, the sun dipping low, casting long, ominous shadows across the rutted track. The wagon, laden with goods or a family, rumbles along, its timbers groaning in protest. Suddenly, a sharp crack, louder than any pothole impact, pierces the air. The wagon lurches violently to one side, throwing its occupants against each other and the wagon walls. A wheel, perhaps weakened by rot, a previous impact, or simply the sheer relentless wear, has given way. It might shatter entirely, a splinters of wood and bent iron flung in all directions, or it might simply buckle, its spokes snapping like dry twigs, leaving the axle digging into the unforgiving earth. The immediate aftermath was a cocktail of panic and frustration. The driver, often the most skilled individual on board, would scramble to assess the damage. But what could he do? Medieval wagon wheels were not interchangeable parts that could be simply swapped out. They were often custom made, fitted to a specific axle. The wood itself might be waterlogged, rotten, or split, rendering any attempt at a swift, effective repair a Herculean task. The tools available were rudimentary at best: a heavy hammer, a saw, perhaps a brace and bit, and a supply of iron nails or rivets. If the hub was damaged, or a significant number of spokes had failed, the entire wheel was likely beyond salvaging on the roadside. Consider the common ailment of a split felloe, one of the curved segments that form the circumference of the wheel. A severe crack here could mean the tire, the iron band that held the whole assembly together, would loosen and eventually slip off, rendering the wheel useless. Or perhaps a spoke would snap at its tenon, the part that fitted into the hub. Without specialized tools to remove the broken tenon and create a new, perfectly fitting one, the wagoner was often faced with the grim reality of being immobilized. The repairs, even for minor damage, were laborious. If a new spoke was needed, it had to be shaped with a draw knife and spoke shave, its ends carefully carved to fit the mortises in the hub and the felloes. Then, the iron tire, which had been heated in a forge until glowing red, would be shrunk onto the periphery of the wheel, binding it all together. This process was impossible to replicate on the side of a muddy track without a portable forge and skilled blacksmith. More often than not, the traveler was left with the unenviable task of improvisation. Perhaps a sturdy branch could be lashed to the broken wheel to provide some semblance of support. Leather straps, if available, might be used to bind cracked fellows, but these were desperate measures, akin to patching a gaping wound with a postage stamp. The wagon would proceed at a snail's pace, each revolution of the damaged wheel a painful reminder of their predicament. The vibrations would intensify, the strain on the remaining parts of the wagon increasing with every jolt. The ultimate destination might be a day or two's journey away, and the prospect of traversing that distance on a crippled vehicle was a daunting one. The weather, of course, was an omnipresent factor that could turn a mere inconvenience into a genuine crisis. If a wheel failed during a downpour, the mud would become a treacherous mire, sucking at the wagon and making even the simplest adjustments a sodden, miserable affair. The wind could howl, chilling travelers to the bone, while the rain lashed down, rendering hands numb and making tools slippery. And if the failure occurred in winter, the biting cold could set in, threatening frostbite and hypothermia. Imagine trying to mend a broken wheel with fingers already stiff and unresponsive from the cold, the ground a frozen, unyielding mass. The sparks from a flint and steel, if one was lucky enough to have a fire going, would be quickly extinguished by the wind and rain. Beyond the immediate mechanical failure, the very materials used in wagon construction were often a source of vulnerability. Wood, while plentiful, was susceptible to rot, especially if improperly seasoned or stored. A wagon left out in the elements between journeys could find its wheels silently decaying, the wood turning spongy and weak, awaiting its inevitable failure. Iron tires, while crucial for durability, could also buckle or break under extreme stress, particularly if they were of poor quality or had been poorly fitted. The constant pounding on uneven surfaces could cause the tire to deform, eventually loosening its grip on the wooden wheel. The isolation of the medieval road amplified the consequences of such breakdowns. There were no roadside assistance services, no garages to call. Travelers were often entirely at the mercy of their own resources and the chance of encountering another passing traveler who might possess the necessary skills or materials. But the roads were not always busy, and the likelihood of finding a skilled carpenter or wheelwright willing to undertake a roadside repair was slim. The more common solution was to attempt a temporary fix and limp to the nearest settlement. However, nearest could mean many miles, and the journey on a damaged wagon was slow, arduous, and precarious. The risk of further damage or complete collapse was ever present. If the damage was severe, or if no solution could be found, travelers might be forced to abandon their wagon entirely, salvaging what they could and continuing on foot. This was a particularly grim fate for those carrying significant amounts of goods, or for families with young children. The loss of the wagon meant the loss of their belongings, their shelter, and their mobility. They would become, in essence, refugees on the road, their journey abruptly and disastrously curtailed. The prospect of such abandonment hung like a Damocles sword over every medieval traveler, a constant, unspoken fear that underscored the precariousness of their undertaking. Even the process of transporting the wagon to a place where it could be properly repaired was a challenge. If the damage was not catastrophic, but rather a significant weakening, the wagon might need to be towed by oxen or even carried on the backs of strong men, a process that was slow, expensive, and often required the pooling of resources from multiple individuals. The cost of repairs, even when a skilled craftsman was found, could be exorbitant, further adding to the financial burden of travel. The reliance on these often fragile wooden constructs meant that any journey, no matter how well planned, was always subject to the whims of fate and the inherent limitations of the technology. The medieval road was a place where the traveler was not merely at the mercy of the weather or other people, but also at the mercy of the very means by which they traveled. A broken wheel was not merely an inconvenience, it was a stark, tangible manifestation of the unreliability that defined so much of medieval existence. The journey was a gamble, and the wheel of misfortune was always ready to spin. The weary traveler, having endured days, perhaps weeks, of bone jarring travel, finally spies it on the horizon, the familiar silhouette of a village. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, a church spire pricks the sky, and the comforting sight of thatched roofs promises respite. The traveler, filled with a surge of relief, urges their faltering steed or creaking wagon forward, anticipating the warmth of an inn, a hearty meal, and a soft bed. They arrive at the edge of this seemingly familiar haven, a picture of hopeful exhaustion, and dismount, ready to inquire about the renowned Gilded Goose Inn, or perhaps the hospitable King's Head. "Good day to you, kind sir," they might call out to a farmer mending a fence, or a woman drawing water from a well. "Might you point me towards the dwelling of Agnes the baker? I'm told her rye bread is the finest for leagues around." Or perhaps, "Pray tell, where might I find the ferryman to cross the river? I am bound for Oakhaven." The response, however, is rarely what the traveler expects. Instead of helpful directions, they are met with a curious, often bewildered expression. "Agnes the baker? Never heard of her, friend," might be the reply. Or Oakhaven? "You're a good day's ride south of there, unless you've taken a dreadful wrong turn somewhere." The initial reactions, of course, confusion. Surely this is Oakhaven. The same river, the same general landscape, the same type of humble dwellings. The traveler might press the point, perhaps mentioning a specific landmark they were told to expect, only to be met with further bewilderment. The whispering oak? Aye, we have an oak, but it's more of a grumbler than a whisperer, and it's by the North Road, not the South. This, dear reader, was the insidious, soul destroying curse of medieval nomenclature, the sheer, unadulterated prevalence of identical village names. Imagine the sheer, maddening inconvenience. Your destination, meticulously researched, whispered about in hushed tones by fellow travelers as a haven of good ale and sturdy lodgings, is simply not there. Or rather, a village of that name is there, but it's the wrong one entirely. The roads, such as they were notoriously poorly marked, and maps, if they existed and were accessible, were often more artistic interpretations than accurate geographical representations. For a traveler relying on word of mouth or vague directions, stumbling upon the wrong Fordington or Bishop's Creek was not merely a setback, it was a deeply demoralizing descent into a labyrinth of geographical misdirection. The traveler, crestfallen, might ask, but I was told this was Oakhaven. The Oakhaven with the bridge that, well, the bridge that spans the swift current. The villager, perhaps sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful, might shrug. We're Oakhaven, sir, always have been, and our bridge spans a modest stream, barely enough to wet your boots if you step too close. The traveler might then recall that their intended Oakhaven was rumored to have a rather imposing stone bridge, not a mere wooden crossing. But by then, the doubt had taken root. The very foundations of their journey, their understanding of where they were and where they were going, began to crumble. The implications of this pervasive naming convention were staggering. A traveler aiming for the bustling market town of King's Cross in the hopes of acquiring fine silks might find themselves in a tiny hamlet of the same name, where the most exciting commodity on offer is a slightly moldy sack of turnips. The disappointment after arduous travel could be profound. The anticipation of a thriving trade hub, a place buzzing with activity and opportunity, would evaporate, replaced by the grim reality of a quiet, unassuming agricultural village. And then the agonizing decision: turn back, losing valuable time and resources, or press on, hoping against hope that the next King's Cross would be the correct one. The humor in this situation, if one could find it amidst the frustration, lay in the sheer absurdity of it all. Imagine a cartographer tasked with mapping the realm. He diligently marks down a saint, Jude's Cross. Weeks later, he receives reports of another saint, Jude's Cross, that has sprung up in a completely different region, populated by entirely different people with entirely different customs, yet bearing the same blessed appellation. It was as if the very act of naming a settlement was a democratic, free-for-all affair, with no central authority to prevent the wholesale duplication of nomenclature. Perhaps a village elder, upon settling a new patch of land, would declare, "Let us call this place Greenwood. It is a fine name, signifying our verdant surroundings." Unbeknownst to him, 100 leagues away, another group of settlers, equally inspired by their own leafy surroundings, were also christening their new home Greenwood. The consequences for trade and communication were dire. A merchant dispatch sent to New Haven might end up in a fishing village on the coast when its intended recipient was in a landlocked trading post. The missive, meant to confirm a lucrative deal, would arrive weeks late, if at all, to the wrong New Haven, causing immense financial repercussions and irate correspondence that would likely be lost in transit anyway. Couriers, the very lifeblood of information, would spend their days playing a high stakes game of geographical roulette, their only recourse often being to ask repeatedly, "Is this the Fountain Inn that is renowned for its strong ale and proximity to the castle, or merely the other Fountain Inn that happens to be next to a rather large dung heap?" The lack of definitive landmarks further compounded the problem. While one might be directed to the village with the tall church spire, the medieval landscape was often dotted with numerous such spires, each belonging to a different, yet identically named settlement. The sheer ubiquity of churches, the central organizing principle of so many medieval communities, ironically contributed to the disorientation. A traveler might see a spire, head towards it with a hopeful heart, only to arrive at a village that bore no resemblance to the one they were seeking, save for the architectural similarity of its religious edifice. Consider the plight of a pilgrim. Their journey, already fraught with peril and hardship, would be immeasurably complicated by this naming convention. They might be seeking the reputed healing waters of St. Swithin's Well in Welsford. They arrive at a village called Welsford, locate the well, drink deeply, and await the miraculous mending of their ailments. Days pass, and no improvement. It transpires they are in the wrong Welsford, a much less auspicious place, and the true Saint Swithin's Well lies a considerable distance away, in another Welsford entirely. The wasted effort, the dashed hopes, and the sheer indignity of being misled by a name could break even the most devout spirit. The issue was so pervasive that it likely spawned a unique dialect of navigational shorthand. Travelers would develop elaborate methods for distinguishing between identical locations. "Ah, you seek the Oak Inn?" a local might say, seeing the traveler's confusion. "You must be thinking of the Oak Inn that lies 2 leagues east of the miller's pond, where the miller's dog always barks at the moon. Not the Oak Inn by the river, where the fishermen mend their nets. That's the River Oak." This kind of intricate, highly localized disambiguation, passed down through generations, was essential for survival on the medieval roads. It was a form of oral cartography, a verbal web spun to prevent travelers from literally going in circles. This linguistic entanglement meant that much of a traveler's time was spent in a state of perpetual low-grade anxiety. Every approaching village, every crossroads, was a potential pitfall. The initial relief upon seeing signs of habitation would be tempered with a deep-seated wariness. Was this the right place? Were the directions accurate? Or was this merely another impostor, another geographical ghost bearing a familiar name? The mental toll of such uncertainty, coupled with the physical rigors of travel, would be immense. It was a constant reminder that even the most carefully planned itinerary could be derailed by the simple, frustrating reality of a world that seemed to have run out of unique names for its settlements. Furthermore, the concept of a village identity itself became a fluid and often contradictory notion. When multiple villages shared a name, which one truly owned it? Did the original settlement have a claim over the newcomers? Or was identity tied to the most prominent or prosperous version of the name? This ambiguity would likely lead to spirited, if ultimately futile, debates in taverns and market squares. Our Oak Haven is the true Oak Haven, One might argue, for our oak has stood for longer, and our river runs swifter. To which a resident of the other Oak Haven would retort, nonsense. Our Oak Haven is the one visited by the king himself, and our ale is brewed from the purest spring water. The humor, in retrospect, is undeniable. Picture a nobleman accustomed to clear hierarchies and precise pronouncements, attempting to deliver a royal decree to a specific baron's rest. He arrives at a village bearing the name, presents himself to the local lord, only to be met with a polite but firm, "My lord, I am Baron Reginald, and this is indeed Baron's Rest. Perhaps you seek Baron Cuthbert's Rest, which lies beyond the haunted woods." The nobleman, whose entire journey was predicated on the assumption of unique identifiers, would be left sputtering, his meticulously prepared pronouncements utterly useless in the face of such pervasive homonymic chaos. This linguistic chaos wasn't just a mild inconvenience, it was a fundamental flaw in the infrastructure of medieval travel. It demonstrated a world where practical considerations often took a back seat to tradition, simplicity, or perhaps sheer oversight. The desire to honor a patron saint, a local landmark, or a revered ancestor by naming a new settlement after it was a strong one, but without a mechanism to ensure uniqueness, this well intentioned act created a tangled web of confusion that ensnared countless travelers. It was a testament to the fact that, even in a world striving for order, the human tendency towards repetition and imitation could lead to the most bewildering of outcomes. The journey from point A to point B was never a simple straight line. It was a winding path, often dictated by the capricious nature of place names, a path that could easily lead one to a perfectly respectable yet utterly wrong destination. The medieval traveler was not just battling the road and the weather, they were battling the very language used to describe their world. The medieval traveler, having weathered the vagaries of identical village names and the navigational nightmares they spawned, might have hoped for a moment's respite. But as they finally navigated the labyrinth of homonymous settlements and arrived at a place that, by all accounts, was the place they sought, a new, far more sinister threat loomed: illness. The very act of journeying across the often unsanitary medieval landscape was an invitation to a host of unwelcome companions, chief among them the common cold and its far more menacing relatives. The open road, while offering a taste of freedom, was also a fertile breeding ground for disease. Without the modern conveniences of sanitation, widespread vaccination, or even a rudimentary understanding of germ theory, a simple sniffle could, and often did, morph into a life-threatening ordeal. Imagine, if you will, our weary traveler, perhaps after a particularly damp and chilly night spent under poorly mended canvas, waking with that telltale tickle in their throat. It might begin innocuously enough: a slight chill, a runny nose, the kind of affliction that in a more enlightened age would be treated with rest, fluids, and perhaps a dose of vitamin C. But in the medieval era, this was the nascent stage of a potentially catastrophic event. There were no pharmacies stocked with over-the-counter remedies, no doctors readily available to prescribe antibiotics. The traveler's recourse was limited to a bizarre and often ineffective arsenal of folk cures, prayers, and the grim hope that their own constitution would prove robust enough to overcome the invading pathogens. Consider the agonizing irony. The traveler has finally reached their destination, perhaps a bustling market town where they intended to conduct a lucrative business, or a distant relative's home where long awaited familial solace awaited. They arrive, and within hours they are struck down. The debilitating fever sets in, the aches and pains become unbearable, and a hacking cough racks their frame. They are miles from home, stranded in a place where they are an unknown quantity, and the local remedies, if they are even accessible, are as likely to do harm as good. The very society they sought to join now views them with suspicion as a potential carrier of contagion, an unwelcome harbinger of sickness. The consequences were often devastating. A fever that raged unchecked could lead to delirium, rendering the traveler incapable of communicating their needs or even recognizing their surroundings. Dehydration was a constant threat, and the concept of carefully rehydrating a sick person was not as universally understood as it is today. Instead, treatments might involve bloodletting, purging with harsh purgatives, or the application of poultices made from herbs that had no proven efficacy against viral or bacterial infections. These interventions, born out of a desperate need to do something, were often more harmful than the illness itself. The traveler might find themselves confined to a damp, ill ventilated room in a crowded inn, the shared conditions further exacerbating their ailment and potentially spreading it to others. The innkeeper, fearing for their business and the health of their other patrons, might be less than sympathetic, treating the sick traveler as an unwelcome burden. Without the support of family, friends, or a robust healthcare system, the afflicted individual was left to face their sickness with little more than a prayer and a growing sense of despair. This vulnerability was amplified by the sheer difficulty of sustained travel. Even a mild illness could render a person physically incapable of undertaking the arduous journey back home. Imagine a traveler struck by a particularly virulent influenza, or worse, a more serious respiratory infection. The coughing fits alone would make riding a horse or enduring the jolting of a cart an excruciating experience. Their strength would dwindle, their ability to endure hardship would evaporate, and the prospect of retracing their steps, often over many days or weeks, would become an insurmountable obstacle. The outcome was often a permanent state of infirmity. The traveler might recover, in a manner of speaking, but be left with lingering weakness, chronic coughs, or damaged lungs. They might be too frail to resume their previous life, their capacity for labor diminished, their ability to travel curtailed. Such individuals could find themselves stranded far from their familiar surroundings, dependent on the charity of strangers, or forced to find a new, often humbler existence in the place where they fell ill. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to be reduced to relying on a donkey or cart for even short distances, their own legs no longer capable of bearing their weight. A stark physical testament to the toll disease had taken. The medical understanding of the time did little to alleviate this grim reality. Illness was often attributed to imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, miasmas, bad air, or divine displeasure. Treatments were based on these theories, often involving complex and unpleasant procedures that were more akin to spiritual cleansing or appeasement than scientific medicine. The concept of a pathogen, a microscopic organism, invisible to the naked eye, was centuries away from being understood. Therefore, the methods employed to combat disease were fundamentally misdirected. Consider a traveler afflicted with dysentery, a common and often fatal ailment, particularly in unsanitary conditions. The relentless bouts of sickness would leave them severely dehydrated and weakened. The available treatments might include purging the bowels further, which would only worsen the dehydration, or prescribing herbal concoctions whose primary effect was to induce vomiting, further depleting their already scarce resources. The fear of contamination was also a significant factor. In a time when the transmission of disease was poorly understood, contact with a sick person was often viewed with apprehension, leading to the isolation of the afflicted and a lack of proper care. Even seemingly minor ailments could have disproportionately severe consequences. A traveler suffering from a bad cough might find their chest muscles strained to the point where they could barely breathe, let alone engage in strenuous activity. A persistent headache, if severe enough, could lead to a general malaise that made all other aspects of travel unbearable. The cumulative effect of these discomforts, on top of the already significant physical demands of medieval travel, could quickly wear down the most resilient individual. The lack of reliable medical expertise meant that diagnoses were often inaccurate, and treatments, when administered, were frequently inappropriate. A physician might be consulted, but their knowledge was often based on ancient texts rather than practical experience, and their treatments could be expensive, painful, and ultimately ineffective. For the common traveler, the services of a learned physician were often out of reach, leaving them to the mercy of local healers whose methods might be based on superstition rather than any form of medical science. The traveler who fell ill also faced the dawning prospect of being unable to communicate their needs effectively. A fever could induce delirium, making coherent speech impossible. Even without delirium, unfamiliar dialects, regional accents, and the sheer stress of the situation could make it difficult to explain the nature of their suffering. This communication breakdown would further isolate them and hinder their ability to receive appropriate care. They might be unable to articulate the specific symptoms that were most troubling, leading to a misdiagnosis or a delayed treatment. The economic implications were also profound. A traveler undertaking a journey for business or trade might lose valuable opportunities due to their illness. The cost of prolonged stays in inns, the expense of ineffective remedies, and the inability to conduct their affairs could lead to significant financial hardship. For those undertaking a pilgrimage, an illness could mean missing important religious observances or failing to reach their sacred destination, a spiritual blow of immense consequence. The harshness of the medieval environment only compounded the problem. Exposure to extreme weather, inadequate shelter, and poor nutrition weakened the body's natural defenses, making it more susceptible to illness. A traveler caught in a blizzard without adequate provisions or forced to endure a scorching summer heat wave without sufficient water would already be in a compromised state, far more vulnerable to the onset of disease. The impact on social interactions was also significant. A visibly ill traveler could be shunned by the local populace, their presence feared as a potential vector for contagion. This ostracism, while perhaps understandable from a primitive public health perspective, would only deepen the traveler's misery and isolation. They might be denied lodging, food, or even basic assistance, left to fend for themselves in their weakened state. The legend of the traveler who fell ill and was forever changed, perhaps becoming a mendicant, a beggar, or a burden on their family, was not an exaggeration, but a stark reality for many. The journey was not merely a physical undertaking, it was a gamble with one's own health and well being. The roads were lined not only with the ghosts of bandits and the wreckage of overturned carts, but also with the invisible specters of disease, waiting to claim their toll. Imagine the profound despair of realizing that the very sickness that afflicted you was preventable had you been in a different time or place, or possessed a different understanding of your own body. This was the curse of the common cold, and worse, for the medieval traveler, a constant lurking threat that could transform a grand adventure into a tragic, solitary battle for survival, often ending not in a triumphant return home, but in a lonely, debilitated existence, far from everything they knew and loved. The inability to escape the pervasive presence of illness, even as they sought to escape the familiar confines of their own villages, was perhaps the most profound and pervasive hardship of all. It was a stark reminder that while the world was vast and full of wonders, it was also teeming with invisible dangers, ready to ensnare the unwary and the unfortunate. The journey was not just a test of endurance, it was a constant, precarious dance with mortality. The medieval traveler, having navigated the treacherous paths, deciphered cryptic directions, and perhaps even survived a bout of plague induced paranoia, might have believed the worst of their travails were behind them. Yet, as they ventured further, relying on the very creatures sworn to ease their burden, they often discovered that their steadfast companions could transform into obstinate adversaries. The beasts of burden, so essential to the very fabric of medieval locomotion, were themselves a wellspring of potential disaster, their often unpredictable natures capable of turning a grand expedition into a prolonged exercise in sheer, unadulterated frustration. Imagine for a moment a caravan laboriously making its way across a rutted track, the sun beating down with relentless fury. The weary traveler, perhaps clinging to the hope of reaching a bustling market town by nightfall, finds their progress arrested not by a fallen tree or a washed out bridge, but by the sheer, unyielding inertia of a single mule. This particular mule, possessed of a will as sturdy as its own bray, has decided, with the capricious logic only an animal can muster, that the current spot is precisely where it wishes to remain. No amount of gentle persuasion, no amount of fervent coaxing, and certainly no amount of sharp, but ultimately futile prodding will convince it otherwise. It simply plants its hooves, lowers its head, and becomes, for all intents and purposes, a furry, four-legged boulder. The caravan, a chain of dependence, is brought to a standstill. The ox cart behind, laden with precious wool, cannot proceed. The pack horses, their backs groaning under the weight of imported spices, are equally stuck. Hours can bleed into one another as the owner of the stubborn mule engages in a silent, desperate war of wills, a miniature drama played out against the backdrop of a vast, indifferent landscape. The promised arrival at dusk becomes a distant, increasingly improbable fantasy. Then there were the horses, the noble steeds that in tales of chivalry galloped valiantly into the fray. In reality, these magnificent creatures, when burdened with the weight of travel and subjected to the often harsh realities of medieval equestrian care, could be just as prone to unruliness as any mule. A sudden fright, the glint of sunlight on a discarded piece of armor, the unexpected caw of a raven, or even a particularly pungent whiff of wild garlic could send a horse into a sudden, terrifying bolt. The rider, clinging precariously to the saddle, might find themselves not guiding their mount, but desperately trying to survive its wild flight. This was not a controlled charge. This was pure, unadulterated panic, the horse a blur of panicked muscle and flailing hooves, oblivious to the path ahead, only intent on escaping the perceived terror. Such an event could lead a traveler miles off course into treacherous terrain, or worse, result in a serious fall, leaving them injured and alone. Their steed vanished into the wilderness, taking their hopes of timely arrival with it. The oxen, the slow and steady workhorses of the medieval world, were not immune to their own unique brand of recalcitrance. While generally more placid, their immense strength could be wielded with surprising obstinacy. A team of oxen, harnessed to a heavy cart laden with grain or building materials, might simply decide, in unison, that they had exerted enough effort for the day. They would cease their forward motion, their powerful muscles refusing to yield, their massive frames rooted to the spot. The driver, sweating and cursing, would find his efforts to urge them onward utterly in vain. Kicks that would barely register on a horse could be met with a dismissive twitch of an ox's flank. Coaxing and encouraging were often met with blank stares and an unwavering commitment to inaction. The sheer weight of the load, combined with the beast's refusal to move, could render the entire operation immobile. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was a deliberate, powerful statement of intent. We are not moving. And so, the essential goods would remain stranded, the journey stalled, and the traveler forced to endure the indignity of being defeated by a creature seemingly more interested in chewing cud than fulfilling its contractual obligations. These moments of animal defiance were not isolated incidents, but rather a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety for any medieval traveler. They were the unwritten hazards of the road, as predictable in their unpredictability as the weather. A traveler might spend weeks meticulously planning their route, ensuring they had ample provisions, and meticulously checking their saddlebags for essential tools. Yet, all this preparation could be undone by a single ill-tempered donkey. Consider the donkey, often prized for its sure-footedness and endurance, which could on occasion possess a stubbornness that defied all logic. These creatures, when possessed by a sudden whim, could refuse to cross a stream, balk at a slight incline, or simply lie down in the middle of a vital thoroughfare, requiring a Herculean effort to dislodge. Their low-slung bodies, when firmly planted, presented a formidable obstacle, and their surprising strength when resisting could easily overpower a less than vigorous handler. The consequences of these animal-induced delays were multifaceted and often dire. Precious time, the most valuable commodity on any journey, was irrevocably lost. This could mean missing market days, failing to arrive for important appointments, or being forced to camp in potentially dangerous locations as darkness descended. The financial ramifications could be significant, especially for merchants whose livelihoods depended on timely delivery. Furthermore, these stoppages could drain the traveler's reserves of patience and good humor, fraying their nerves and making them more susceptible to other misfortunes. The stress of dealing with a recalcitrant beast could easily spill over into interactions with other people, leading to unnecessary conflicts or misunderstandings. The sheer physical exertion involved in moving a stubborn animal also took its toll. Hours spent wrestling with a mule, cajoling a horse, or attempting to heave an uncooperative ox could leave the traveler utterly exhausted, further diminishing their capacity to handle the remaining leg of their journey. This exhaustion, combined with the frustration, could lead to a dangerous lapse in judgment, such as taking unnecessary risks or neglecting essential tasks like checking equipment or tending to their own needs. The animal's mood could also be influenced by its treatment. Medieval husbandry, while often practical, lacked the nuanced understanding of animal welfare that we possess today. Harsh handling, inadequate feeding, or prolonged periods of strenuous work without rest could all contribute to an animal's reluctance or outright refusal to cooperate. A traveler might inherit a beast of burden that was already predisposed to bad behavior, its spirit broken by previous mistreatment, thus compounding the traveler's own difficulties. It was a vicious cycle where the stresses of travel could lead to the mistreatment of animals, which in turn led to greater travel stresses. Moreover, the very process of managing a team of animals was a complex undertaking. A traveler might have to manage a horse, a pack mule, and perhaps an ox cart. Each animal had its own needs, its own temperament, and its own potential for causing chaos. Keeping them all moving in the same direction at a reasonable pace and without incident was akin to conducting a symphony of ill-matched instruments. A lapse in attention could see one animal wander off, another fall lame, and a third decide to engage in a territorial dispute with a passing dog. The breakdown of an animal could also present a logistical nightmare. If a horse went lame, how was the rider to proceed? If an ox collapsed, how was its immense weight to be moved, or its load transferred to another, potentially less capable animal? These were not hypothetical dilemmas, but the grim realities faced by countless travelers. The absence of a readily available replacement animal, or the inability to improvise a solution, could effectively maroon the traveler, forcing them to abandon their journey or seek assistance from unreliable sources. The reliance on animals was a double-edged sword. While they facilitated travel over distances and terrain that would otherwise be insurmountable, they also introduced a fundamental element of unpredictability. The traveler was not just at the mercy of the weather, the roads, and other people, they were also at the mercy of the animal kingdom, specifically the often unpredictable wills of creatures whose primary motivation was not the traveler's destination, but their own immediate comfort, safety, or perhaps just a deeply ingrained sense of mulishness. This meant that the traveler's success or failure was intrinsically linked to the cooperation of beings that could not, by their very nature, fully comprehend or care about the traveler's objectives. The journey was, in essence, a continuous negotiation with the animal kingdom, a negotiation that was frequently lost. The return of a traveler was an event that, even in its most mundane form, carried the weight of the world. For those who had ventured beyond the familiar, through fog-shrouded forests and across sun-baked plains, their narratives became more than mere accounts of mileage covered. They transformed into vibrant, often exaggerated tapestries woven from threads of hardship, humor, and sheer, unadulterated luck. These were the tattered tales, the oral histories passed from one anxious hearth to another, shaping perceptions of the world beyond the village palisades. Consider the convivial gatherings that inevitably sprung up in the aftermath of a successful, or at least survivable, journey. A returned pilgrim, his cloak mended countless times, and his face etched with the dust of 1,000 leagues, would find himself the center of rapt attention. Around him, villagers would huddle, their eyes wide, not just with curiosity, but with a palpable sense of vicarious experience. And then the pilgrim might begin, his voice raspy from disuse and perhaps a touch of ale. As we approached the cursed ford, where the water runs, swift and deep, no less than 6 brigands, their faces masked with black wool, emerged from the tangled brush. The tale would unfold, a masterpiece of dramatic pauses and widening gestures. The brigands, initially presented as mere ruffians, would invariably grow in number and ferocity with each retelling. They might wield swords that gleamed with an unholy light, or perhaps possess a cunning that would make a fox blush. The traveler, in this embellished account, would not simply be a victim, he would be a paragon of quick wit and astonishing bravery. Perhaps he had outsmarted them with a riddle, or more likely, managed to bribe them with the few coins he had left, a scenario that, while less heroic, often elicited more sympathetic chuckles. The merchant, too, had his own repertoire of misadventures. His journeys, often driven by the pursuit of profit, were frequently punctuated by the indignity of mechanical failure and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of inanimate objects. Imagine a merchant, stout and red faced, recounting the ordeal of a broken wagon wheel in the middle of a desolate fen. The wheel, good people, he'd declare, thumping the table for emphasis. It did not merely break. Nay, it shattered into 1,000 splinters, as if struck by the very wrath of an offended saint. And the wagon, piled high with finest Flemish cloth, it lurched, and it tipped, and it began to sink, inch by agonizing inch, into that foul, sucking mire. The details would be painted with broad strokes, the desperate attempts to lever the wagon free, the sinking into the mud that clung with a malevolent embrace, the arduous, back-breaking task of salvaging the precious cargo piece by piece, all while keeping a wary eye out for anything that might resemble a predatory beast lurking in the reeds. The sheer ignominy of it all, a man of commerce, reduced to wrestling with mud and splintered wood, was a source of endless amusement for his listeners. And then there were the tales that bordered on the fantastical, the accounts that, upon closer inspection, seemed to have acquired a few extra legs or a considerably sharper set of teeth in the telling. A traveler might speak of encountering wolves, not as furtive, shy creatures, but as a snarling pack, each the size of a small pony, their eyes burning with a preternatural hunger. Or perhaps a journey through a particularly dense forest would be described as an odyssey through a realm of gnarled, sentient trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, their rustling leaves whispering dire prophecies. These were the stories that truly captured the imagination, blurring the lines between the real and the imagined, between the perils of the road and the whispers of folklore. These narratives, passed from person to person, often underwent subtle or not so subtle transformations. The original incident, perhaps a minor inconvenience or a moment of mild fright, would be amplified and reshaped to fit the established conventions of good storytelling. A slight delay caused by a recalcitrant donkey might evolve into a harrowing encounter with a malevolent spirit, or a simple case of getting lost could be spun into a terrifying odyssey through an enchanted labyrinth. The tellers themselves, consciously or unconsciously, would polish and refine their accounts, honing the punchlines, sharpening the descriptions, and ensuring that each tale possessed the requisite drama and emotional resonance. The very act of storytelling became a ritual, a way of processing the often brutal realities of travel. By recounting their experiences, travelers could impose order on chaos, transforming random misfortunes into coherent narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. They could transform themselves from passive victims of circumstance into active protagonists, masters of their own fates, even if only in retrospect. The laughter that often punctuated these tales was not merely a reaction to humor, it was also a release of tension, a communal acknowledgement of the shared human vulnerability to the unpredictable forces of the world. Furthermore, these tattered tales served a vital, if often unacknowledged, function. They acted as a form of collective memory and informal education. For those who had never ventured far from home, these stories provided a glimpse into the wider world, a world that was both alluring and terrifying. They instilled a healthy respect for the dangers that lay beyond familiar horizons, serving as a constant, if sometimes exaggerated, reminder of the risks involved in leaving the safety of the hearth. A young man contemplating a journey to a distant city, having listened to tales of treacherous mountain passes and the rapaciousness of certain innkeepers, might reconsider his plans, or at least approach his preparations with a far greater degree of caution. The embellishments, the exaggerations, and the outright fabrications were not necessarily malicious. They were, in many cases, the very essence of what made the stories engaging and memorable. The stark truth of a difficult journey, stripped of all artistic license, could be quite dull. It was the vivid imagery, the heightened emotions, and the unexpected twists of fortune that transformed a simple account into a compelling performance. The traveler who reported that his horse had simply gotten tired would be met with polite nods and a quick change of subject. But the traveler who described his steed in a moment of desperate flight from pursuing bandits, clearing a chasm that even a mountain goat would fear to tread, would command a room and ensure his listeners remained captivated until the final, triumphant, and perhaps entirely fabricated flourish. The communal aspect of storytelling was also crucial. A single traveler might have a story, but a group of travelers, sharing their experiences, would create a richer, more multifaceted picture of the journey. One might recount a particularly harrowing encounter with a pack of wild dogs, while another might recall a moment of unexpected kindness from a stranger encountered along the way. Pieced together, these disparate fragments of experience would form a complex mosaic, offering a more complete, albeit still subjective, understanding of the road. It was in these shared narratives that the true essence of medieval travel, with all its interwoven strands of peril, resilience, and human connection, was truly captured. The tales, tattered and worn as they might be, formed a vital thread in the fabric of medieval life, connecting the present to the past, the known to the unknown, and the individual experience to the collective consciousness. They were the echoes of journeys taken, whispered into the ears of those who might one day follow. The very nature of these collected anecdotes meant that they often leaned towards the dramatic and the perilous. After all, a journey uneventfully completed rarely made for a compelling narrative. It was the moments of near disaster, the unexpected detours, and the sheer, unadulterated terror that were most readily recalled and most eagerly shared. A merchant might recount the time his heavily laden cart, attempting to navigate a particularly steep and muddy incline, had begun to slide backwards, its massive weight threatening to crush anything unfortunate enough to be in its path. The tale would detail the frantic efforts of the oxen, their strained bellows echoing in the oppressive silence, and the merchant's own desperate attempts to jam stones beneath the wheels, his hands raw and bleeding from the effort. The climax of such a story would invariably be the moment of apparent inevitability, the cart teetering on the brink of disaster, followed by a miraculous reprieve, perhaps a fortunate shift in the ground or the sudden inexplicable traction of a single, deeply embedded root. Similarly, a pilgrim, weary from months on the road, might describe the harrowing experience of being caught in a sudden, violent storm. The wind, he'd explain, did not merely blow, it howled like a legion of tormented souls. The rain did not fall. It lashed down with the force of thrown stones, turning the very earth into a treacherous, churning morass. His meager tent, a fragile shield against the elements, would be described as being torn to shreds, leaving him exposed to the full fury of the tempest. His narrative would then focus on his desperate flight for shelter, perhaps stumbling through the darkness, the lightning illuminating fleeting, terrifying glimpses of the ravaged landscape, until he found refuge in a seemingly abandoned, dilapidated hermitage, its walls groaning under the onslaught, its interior a damp and chilling sanctuary. The relief upon surviving such an ordeal would be palpable in the telling, a testament to sheer grit and a touch of divine intervention. These tales were not solely about the grand and the terrifying, however. They were also replete with instances of profound indignity and absurd misfortune, the kind that elicited groans of sympathy and knowing chuckles. Imagine a traveler who, having finally arrived at a promised inn after a week of sleeping under the open sky, discovers that his carefully hoarded coins are insufficient to pay for a dry bed and a meager meal. The innkeeper, a figure of considerable local authority and often possessing a keen eye for a traveler's desperation, would be depicted as a portly, sneering figure, utterly unmoved by the traveler's plight, perhaps even relishing his discomfort. The traveler, stripped of his funds and his dignity, would be forced to either beg for mercy or, worse, resume his journey with an even emptier stomach and a heavier heart. Another common thread in these tattered tales was the sheer mind-numbing tedium of the journey itself, punctuated by moments of bizarre, almost surreal encounters. A long, uneventful stretch of road could be described with a weary resignation, the traveler lamenting the sameness of the landscape and the endless repetition of the plodding rhythm of his beast of burden. This monotony, however, would often be broken by the appearance of some peculiar individual or event. Perhaps a traveling troupe of mummers, their costumes outlandish and their performances even more so, would materialize out of the mist, offering a fleeting, nonsensical diversion, or a solitary hermit living in apparent squalor in a remote cave might emerge, offering cryptic pronouncements or simply staring with unnerving intensity, his motives and sanity as opaque as the landscape itself. These encounters, while not always overtly dangerous, added a layer of the uncanny and the unpredictable to the traveler's experience, further blurring the lines between the mundane and the extraordinary. The oral transmission of these narratives also meant that they were subject to the biases and personalities of the tellers. A naturally optimistic individual might find the silver lining in even the most dire of circumstances, transforming a near fatal encounter into a tale of remarkable fortune. Conversely, a more morose or cynical traveler might imbue even the most pleasant experiences with an undercurrent of foreboding. The selection of details, the emphasis placed on certain events, and the overall tone of the retelling were all shaped by the storyteller's unique perspective. Thus, the same journey, recounted by two different individuals, could yield vastly different tales, each equally valid in its own way, but offering contrasting windows into the realities of medieval travel. The impact of these stories extended beyond mere entertainment or cautionary advice. They contributed to a collective understanding of the risks and rewards of venturing forth. They fostered a sense of shared experience among those who had undertaken similar journeys, creating bonds of camaraderie that transcended geographical and social divides. For those who remained behind, these tales served to ignite their imaginations, to spark a sense of wonder about the world beyond their immediate surroundings, even as they reinforced the comfort and security of their familiar lives. The tattered tales were, in essence, the voices of the journey made manifest, carrying the weight of experience, the sting of hardship, and the glint of resilience, all woven into the enduring tapestry of human memory. They were the whispered legends that kept the spirit of exploration alive, even as they served as potent reminders of the very real perils that awaited the unwary. The immediate expenses of any medieval sojourn were, of course, the most readily quantifiable. The blacksmith's bill for mending a shoddy buckle, the innkeeper's exorbitant demand for a night's rest, the toll demanded by a lord with more ambition than sense. These were the expected debits against a traveler's purse. However, as any seasoned wanderer could attest, the true economic erosion of a journey often lay in the insidious, unbudgeted costs that materialized like phantom tolls on a dimly lit road. These were the expenditures born not of planned outlays, but of misfortune, chicanery, and the sheer, unyielding recalcitrance of the world. Consider the plight of a merchant transporting a consignment of fine woolens from the shearing fields of Yorkshire to the discerning markets of London. His journey, meticulously planned, accounted for the price of fodder for his weary horses, the hire of a stout cart, and the provision for himself and his driver. Yet, what his ledger did not account for was the sudden, violent downpour that turned a perfectly serviceable track into a quagmire of biblical proportions. The cart, laden with its precious cargo, became mired, its wheels sinking with a sickening squelch into the clinging mud. Extracting it was no simple matter. It demanded not only the brute force of straining horses and the back-breaking labor of the men, but also the assistance of local yokels who, sensing opportunity, appeared as if conjured from the very mud itself. Their help came at a price, of course, a price that escalated with every futile heave of the cart. And even when freed, the woolens themselves suffered. Dampened, stained, and smelling vaguely of pond water, their market value plummeted, effectively a further silent tax levied by the elements. The profit margin, once healthy, now looked anemic, a pale shadow of its former self, all thanks to a few days of inconvenient weather and opportunistic villagers. Then there was the pervasive problem of transit delays. Each hour of standstill, a tangible drain on resources. A ferry crossing, meant to be a swift passage over a river, could easily devolve into a protracted negotiation. The ferryman, a portly individual with a perpetually unimpressed expression, might claim his vessel was in disrepair, or that the river was too treacherous, or that simply put, he felt like taking a nap. Whatever the excuse, it translated into precious time lost, and time, for a merchant or any individual reliant on arrival by a certain date, was money. While waiting, provisions had to be purchased. The horses needed to be fed. The travelers themselves required sustenance. And all the while, the goods in transit were not earning their keep. They were merely waiting in the damp confines of a riverside inn, or perhaps even exposed to the elements if the ferryman's excuses extended to not having enough room in his shed. The cost of this enforced idleness was a burden that could easily outweigh the fee for the ferry itself. Imagine a spice merchant, his crates filled with precious saffron and cinnamon, stuck for 3 days at a river crossing, the cost of stabling his mules and feeding his crew mounting, all while his valuable cargo sat idly, its potential profit ticking away like a slow, agonizing clock. The repair of damaged equipment was another significant and often unpredictable expense. A wagon wheel, weakened by a hidden rot or a poorly executed mend at the previous stop, might shatter on a rough stretch of road. The replacement part, if one could even be found, was rarely of the quality of the original, and its cost was invariably inflated by the desperation of the buyer and the opportunism of the seller. The wagoner, his livelihood tied to the integrity of his vehicle, would be forced to spend not only coin, but also valuable time overseeing the repair, often in some remote village where the local carpenter's skills were more attuned to building hen coops than reinforcing axles. The material costs were one thing, the seasoned oak, the iron banding, but the labor, the time taken away from the actual business of transporting goods, represented a more significant, yet harder to quantify, economic loss. A trader returning from a fair might find his profits significantly diminished, not by the prices he received for his wares, but by the cumulative cost of broken harnesses, a sprung axle, and a ripped sail on his river barge, each a testament to the unforgiving nature of the thoroughfares. Even the most basic necessities of travel, such as food and lodging, could become financially ruinous when one was stranded. A journey delayed by a blizzard in the mountains, or a broken axle on a lonely moor, meant that a traveler's carefully calculated budget for provisions would be swiftly depleted. The nearest inn, if one could even be found, would often charge exorbitant prices for meager fare, knowing full well that their captive audience had no other recourse. A traveler might find himself paying double, even triple, the normal price for a bowl of thin stew and a stale loaf of bread, simply because the alternative was starvation or freezing to death. This was the economics of desperation, where basic survival became a luxury item. The trader who found himself snowed in for a week in a remote mountain pass, his coin dwindling with each passing day as he consumed the overpriced yet essential rations provided by the desperate innkeeper, could easily see his entire venture's profitability evaporate. The true cost of reaching his destination was not merely the miles covered, but the financial depletion incurred by simply waiting out the storm. Furthermore, the very act of seeking assistance could be a costly affair. A traveler whose horse went lame or whose cart lost a wheel was forced to rely on the goodwill, or often the greed, of those encountered. The local smith, while possessing the necessary skills, would charge a premium for his services, knowing that the traveler was in no position to bargain effectively. Bribery, too, played its part. A reluctant ferryman might suddenly become amenable to passage once a few extra coins were pressed into his hand. A guard at a minor toll booth, tasked with extracting a fee, might be persuaded to overlook certain irregularities in a traveler's papers or to grant passage through a shortcut for a suitable incentive. These were the unofficial costs, the grease that lubricated the wheels of travel, and they added up, often unseen, to a significant drain on a traveler's finances. A merchant, for instance, might find himself tipping a stable hand extra to ensure his horses were properly cared for, or paying a village elder a small sum to guarantee safe passage through his territory, despite the absence of any overt threat. These payments, while ostensibly for a service or a benefit, were in reality the cost of mitigating potential problems, a form of insurance paid in advance, but with no guarantee of a return. The psychological toll of these constant, unforeseen expenses also had an economic dimension. The trader, constantly calculating, recalculating, and fretting over potential losses, became less efficient, his focus diverted from the primary goal of profitable trade to the more immediate concern of financial survival. The gnawing anxiety of knowing that a single broken axle or a particularly rapacious toll collector could wipe out weeks of effort and potential gain was a burden in itself. This stress could lead to poorer decision making, a reluctance to invest in better equipment that might in the long run prove more economical, and a general weariness that dulled the adventurous spirit. The merchant who arrived at his destination with his wagon wheels wobbling, his goods slightly water damaged, and his purse significantly lighter than anticipated, was not just financially poorer. He was also less inclined to undertake such a venture again in the immediate future, thus impacting the broader flow of commerce and the economic vitality of the region. The cumulative effect of these economics of exasperation was a tangible drag on medieval commerce, turning many a potentially lucrative journey into a costly exercise in endurance. The true cost of travel was not merely what one paid at the inn or the toll gate, but the sum total of every unexpected expense, every delayed hour, and every moment of financial anxiety incurred along the way. The crucible of medieval travel, with its constant barrage of unforeseen expenses and trials, forged in its travelers a unique brand of wisdom. It was a wisdom hard won, etched onto their very souls by the persistent erosion of their purses and the relentless testing of their resolve. These were not the abstract philosophical musings found in cloistered studies. This was the pragmatic, dirt under the fingernails understanding of how the world truly worked, stripped bare of romantic embellishment. It was a curriculum taught by broken axles, by surly ferrymen, by unseasonal storms, and by the ever present specter of the empty purse. Consider the seasoned merchant, his cloak patched, and his boots well worn, recounting his early journeys to a fresh faced apprentice eager to join the caravan. You see that road? The elder would begin, pointing a gnarled finger towards the dusty track stretching into the horizon. It looks like a path to profit, but remember this, lad. Every mile is a negotiation. The road itself will demand its price. The weather will levy its own taxes, and the folk you meet along the way will be only too happy to assist in emptying your pockets, whether by design or by simple avarice. This was the first and perhaps most crucial lesson. Expect the unexpected and expect it to cost you. The young apprentice, perhaps imagining a swift and lucrative passage, would nod, his mind still on the shiny coins he hoped to earn. The elder would sigh, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He knew the illusion would shatter soon enough, replaced by the cold, hard reality that punctuality was a luxury few could afford, and that preparedness was not merely about packing enough food, but about packing enough contingency. The apprentice might have scoffed internally, thinking the old man was merely a pessimist, but he would soon learn. He would learn that the carefully calculated cost of fodder for the horses did not account for the sudden illness of one of the beasts, necessitating a stop at a village known for its exorbitant veterinary fees. He would discover that the toll demanded by the local baron was not a fixed rate, but a variable based on the perceived wealth of the traveler and the current mood of the collector. He might even learn the hard way that the shortcut offered by a seemingly helpful stranger often led not to his destination, but to a well appointed ambush, where the only payment expected was what remained in his saddlebags. These were not mere inconveniences. They were fundamental aspects of the medieval journey, and to ignore them was to court disaster. This constant need for adaptation fostered an extraordinary level of resourcefulness. The traveler who found himself stranded with a broken cartwheel in the middle of nowhere quickly became an impromptu engineer. He would scout for suitable timber, perhaps a fallen oak that had been seasoned by the sun and wind. He would learn to improvise tools, fashioning crude wedges or levers from sturdy branches. He might even barter with the local peasantry for their assistance, offering a portion of his dwindling provisions or a valuable trinket in exchange for their labor and knowledge of local materials. This wasn't about being a master craftsman. It was about being a survivor, about looking at a pile of broken wood and seeing not just a problem, but a potential solution. A vivid illustration of this ingenuity could be seen in the methods employed to traverse difficult terrain. A swollen river, impassable by conventional means, might necessitate the constructions of a makeshift raft, a precarious undertaking involving the lashing together of logs and the weaving of crude sails from whatever canvas was available. A treacherous mountain pass, blocked by a recent rockfall, could lead to the arduous task of clearing the debris, a collective effort that often involved entire caravans, each individual contributing their strength and will. The spirit of mutual aid, while not always present, could also be a vital lesson. When one wagon broke down, blocking the road, it was often in the best interest of all behind it to lend a hand, for their own passage depended on freeing the impediment. This was not altruism in its purest form, but a pragmatic understanding of shared vulnerability. Moreover, the medieval traveler learned to read the land and its people with an acuity born of necessity. They learned to discern the subtle signs of danger, the unusually quiet woods, the excessive friendliness of strangers, the distant glint of steel that suggested more than just a shepherd's crook. They learned to trust their instincts, a gut feeling that warned them away from a seemingly inviting inn or a too good to be true offer. This heightened awareness was a form of mental armor, protecting them not just from physical harm, but from financial ruin as well. A keen eye could spot a dishonest innkeeper charging inflated prices for watered down wine, or a tax collector attempting to levy a fee that was not legally sanctioned. The sheer act of surviving these journeys instilled a profound appreciation for stability and safety. The traveler, who had spent weeks on the road, enduring cold nights, meager meals, and the constant threat of brigands, would view a warm hearth, a full larder, and the security of solid walls with a reverence that the sedentary could rarely comprehend. The return to one's own village, the familiar faces, the predictable routines, these were not mere comforts, but luxuries of the highest order. The weathered merchant, finally home, would find a deep satisfaction in simply tending his own small garden, the scent of honest earth a welcome balm after the dust and desperation of the road. This hard won appreciation for the mundane often manifested as a deep seated skepticism towards grand pronouncements or easy promises. The phrase, a straightforward journey, would elicit a knowing smirk from those who had traveled. They understood that such pronouncements were usually uttered by those who had never actually undertaken the journey themselves, or by those who stood to profit from the traveler's naivety. The illusion of a smooth passage was a dangerous one, and the traveler who clung to it was often the first to find himself lost, robbed, or otherwise discomfited. The lessons were not always about grand gestures of survival. They were often subtle, woven into the fabric of daily experience. A traveler might learn the importance of a good, sturdy knife, not just for protection, but for everything from cutting rope to preparing a meal. He might learn the value of a strong, reliable cloak that could serve as a blanket, a shelter, or a disguise. He would learn that a well-maintained horse was worth its weight in gold, and that the care of it was paramount. These were the practical, tangible lessons that underpinned survival, the small pieces of knowledge that accumulated over time could mean the difference between reaching one's destination and perishing by the wayside. Furthermore, the constant need to economize, to make every coin stretch as far as possible, bred a shrewdness in financial matters. The medieval traveler became an expert in haggling, not just for goods, but for services. He learned the art of the polite refusal, the subtle negotiation, and the opportune moment to walk away. He understood the true cost of time, not just in terms of lost opportunity, but in terms of increased expenses for lodging and provisions. A day spent waiting for a ford to subside was a day where his own sustenance and that of his animals had to be paid for. This forced financial discipline, while often born of necessity, could also be a valuable asset in later life, allowing individuals to manage their affairs with a prudence that others, who had never known such scarcity, could not fathom. The experience of being an outsider, a stranger in a strange land, also fostered a unique perspective on human nature. The traveler encountered a vast spectrum of individuals, from the genuinely kind and helpful to the utterly deceitful and cruel. He learned to navigate these social landscapes with caution and discernment, to distinguish between genuine hospitality and predatory opportunism. This constant social assessment honed his ability to read people, to understand their motivations, and to gauge their trustworthiness. The tavern keeper, who offered a warm smile and a hearty meal, might be genuinely welcoming, or he might be sizing up his next mark. The village elder who offered advice might be offering wisdom, or he might be leading the traveler into a trap. This constant vigilance, this necessity of looking beneath the surface, was a crucial aspect of the medieval traveler's education. The resilience forged on these journeys was not merely physical, it was profoundly psychological. The ability to endure hardship, to maintain hope in the face of adversity, and to bounce back from setbacks was a testament to the human spirit. The traveler who had faced the threat of starvation, the fear of the unknown, and the sting of betrayal had developed an inner fortitude that served him well in all aspects of his life. He learned that setbacks were not endpoints, but simply detours. He learned that even in the darkest of times, there was often a flicker of hope, a chance for redemption, or a new path to be discovered. This journey, this endless series of challenges and minor victories, ultimately stripped away illusions and fostered a profound sense of pragmatism. The romantic notions of adventure that might have fueled a young man's departure were quickly replaced by the stark realities of survival. The glory of battle was superseded by the quiet triumph of reaching one's destination intact. The pursuit of wealth was tempered by the constant struggle to simply remain solvent. The medieval traveler learned to live in the present, to deal with the immediate challenges at hand, and to make the best of whatever circumstances he found himself in. He understood that the world was not a place of inherent fairness or predictable order, but a complex and often unforgiving arena where success was earned through effort, adaptability, and a healthy dose of good fortune. His wisdom was not written in books, but etched in the lines of his face, in the calluses on his hands, and in the quiet understanding in his eyes that the road, however long and arduous, was ultimately what shaped the traveler. While the grand narratives of medieval journeys often focused on the valiant knights, the intrepid explorers, or the pious pilgrims, the success and even the mere possibility of these endeavors rested heavily upon the shoulders of a far less celebrated, often gruff, but undeniably essential cast of characters. These were the unsung heroes, the bedrock upon which the rickety edifice of medieval travel was built. Their establishments might have been humble, their services rudimentary, and their temperaments occasionally less than saintly, but without them, the arteries of commerce and communication would have seized up entirely. Consider the innkeeper. In the grand tapestry of travel, the inn was not merely a place for a night's rest, it was a vital node, a temporary sanctuary in a world fraught with peril and discomfort. Even the most rudimentary inn, often little more than a barn with a thatched roof and a communal sleeping space, represented a significant step up from sleeping under the stars, exposed to the elements and the myriad dangers that stalked the night. These were not the gleaming hostelries of later eras, nor the cozy inns of romantic fiction, but functional, often drafty, structures where cleanliness was a relative concept, and the aroma of roasting meat mingled with the less pleasant effluvia of tired travelers and their animals. Yet the innkeeper, in his own way, was a purveyor of civilization. He provided a basic level of security, a place to shelter from rain or snow, and most importantly, sustenance. The quality of that sustenance might have varied wildly, from a hearty stew made from locally sourced ingredients to a lump of stale bread and a mug of watered down ale, but it was food. It was the fuel that allowed the journey to continue. These innkeepers operated in a precarious ecosystem. Their own livelihoods were tied to the unpredictable flow of travelers, a flow that could be dramatically interrupted by bad weather, political unrest, or the simple fact that a more conveniently located rival establishment had opened its doors. They had to contend with demanding customers, the occasional rogue who used their establishment as a base for criminal activities, and the ever present threat of bandits who might target their premises. To keep their doors open, they had to be shrewd. They learned to gauge the wealth of their clientele by the state of their clothing and their horses, adjusting their prices accordingly, a practice that, while perhaps unfair by modern standards, was a pragmatic necessity for survival. They often cultivated relationships with local suppliers, ensuring a steady, if sometimes meager, supply of provisions. They learned to be observant, keeping an eye on the comings and goings of their guests, a silent act of protection for themselves and for the other travelers under their roof. The innkeeper was, in essence, a reluctant guardian, a provider of temporary respite, whose very existence was a testament to the enduring human need for shelter and sustenance, however basic. Their tired smiles, often accompanied by a grunt of welcome, masked a constant calculation, a balancing act between profitability and survival, between hospitality and caution. Then there were the ferrymen, rivers, while often providing a source of life and sustenance, were also formidable barriers to travel, capable of transforming from placid streams into raging torrents with little warning. The crossing of these watery obstacles was a critical and often perilous juncture in any journey. The ferryman, whether he operated a simple planked raft pulled by ropes or a more substantial flat bottomed boat, held the power to either facilitate passage or to deny it entirely. His services were indispensable, especially for those carrying goods or traveling with families and livestock. The ferryman's life was one of constant engagement with the unpredictable moods of the water. He knew the currents, the submerged hazards, and the safest crossing points. His craft, often weathered and patched, was his livelihood, and its maintenance was a crucial yet often thankless task. He had to contend with the physical demands of hauling heavy loads, managing anxious animals, and navigating treacherous water. His charges were often levied with a gruff finality. There was little room for negotiation when the alternative was a potentially dangerous or even fatal attempt to ford the river. Yet, for all his gruffness, the ferryman was a vital link in the chain of travel. He was the bridge between 2 points, the facilitator of progress. Imagine the relief of a merchant caravan bogged down by rain and facing a swollen river, seeing the ferryman arrive with his craft, a promise of passage across the formidable barrier. The interaction was brief, transactional, but the service rendered was invaluable. The ferryman, often working alone or with minimal assistance, was a testament to human adaptability and the essential nature of bridging divides, both physical and metaphorical. His boat was not just wood and rope, it was a conduit for commerce, communication, and the continuation of human endeavor. And we must not forget the local guides. While many travelers relied on maps, itineraries, and the hope of following well trodden paths, the reality of medieval travel often meant venturing into unfamiliar and sometimes hostile territories. Here, the local guide became an indispensable asset. These individuals possessed an intimate knowledge of the land, a cartographical understanding etched not on parchment, but in their very being. They knew the hidden trails, the safe havens, the places to avoid, and the individuals to trust or to distrust. The role of the guide was multifaceted. He was the interpreter of the landscape, able to read the subtle signs of the terrain, the direction of the wind, the type of vegetation, the tracks of animals, to discern the safest route. He was also, often, an interpreter of the local customs and dialects, a vital buffer between the traveler and the potentially suspicious or unwelcoming inhabitants of a region. His knowledge was not merely academic, it was practical, born of a lifetime spent navigating the very paths his clients sought to traverse. Hiring a guide was often a gamble. One had to ascertain their trustworthiness, their familiarity with the specific route, and their ability to protect their charges. A dishonest guide could lead travelers into ambushes or deliberately prolong a journey to extract more payment. Yet, a good guide could transform a potentially disastrous expedition into a successful one. He could find fresh water where none was apparent, identify edible plants to supplement meager rations, and negotiate safe passage through territories controlled by feuding lords or bandit groups. The guide was more than just a navigator. He was a protector, a confidant, and often the only source of local wisdom in an alien environment. His presence provided a crucial layer of security and confidence, allowing travelers to focus on their objectives rather than constantly battling the unknown. His willingness to share his knowledge, often for a modest fee, was a quiet act of enabling, a crucial thread in the intricate weave of medieval connectivity. These individuals, the innkeepers, the ferrymen, the guides, were the scaffolding that supported the grander aspirations of medieval travelers. They were the silent partners in every journey, the facilitators of connection in a world that was often fragmented and perilous. Their existence, their labor, and their often underappreciated services were as critical to the functioning of medieval society as the roads themselves or the wagons that traversed them. They were the conduits of the journey, the unsung heroes who, through their often difficult and precarious occupations, kept the wheels of movement, trade, and communication turning, albeit slowly and with considerable effort. Their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their essential, if humble, services were a testament to the interconnectedness of medieval life, a reminder that even the most ambitious journeys were dependent on the small, often gritty, acts of service provided by those who operated at the very edge of the traveler's immediate experience. They were the essential intermediaries, the pragmatic anchors in a sea of uncertainty, ensuring that the echoes of errant journeys did not fade into silence but carried forward, a testament to the enduring human drive to connect, to explore, and to persevere. And so, we arrive at the crux of the matter, a question that might echo in the minds of modern readers accustomed to swift transport and relative comfort. Why, in the name of all that was holy and sturdy, did people undertake such arduous sojourns in the first place? The answer, as we've glimpsed through the eyes of the merchants, the pilgrims, the soldiers, and the diplomats, was a complex tapestry woven from threads of necessity, faith, ambition, and duty. Trade, the lifeblood of any burgeoning economy, demanded the movement of goods, spices from the East, wool from England, wine from France. These commodities did not magically appear in local markets. They required the courage and endurance of merchants, often traveling in vulnerable caravans, braving treacherous roads, unpredictable weather, and the ever present threat of brigands. Their journeys were not fueled by wanderlust, but by the stark reality of profit and loss, the need to supply towns and cities with the materials that sustained life and fostered prosperity. Then there was the magnetic pull of the sacred, pilgrimage, an undertaking that often tested the very limits of human endurance, drew countless souls towards holy sites. Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela. These destinations represented not just physical locations, but spiritual aspirations. The devout endured blistered feet, gnawing hunger, and the constant threat of disease, all in the pursuit of divine favor, penance for sins, or the hope of miraculous intercession. The journey itself was often seen as an integral part of the spiritual purification, a form of living prayer, a testament to the depth of their faith. It was a commitment, often made over years of saving and preparation, that overshadowed the considerable discomforts. War, in its relentless march, also dictated movement. Armies, often vast and unwieldy, traversed continents, leaving a trail of disruption and frequently a legacy of destruction. Soldiers, drawn from diverse backgrounds and regions, marched under banners, their journeys dictated by the strategic whims of kings and commanders. For these men, the promise of glory, plunder, or simply the enforcement of royal authority provided the impetus. Their travel was not for leisure, but for duty, often a grim and brutal imposition. Beyond these primary drivers, there were the obligations of governance and the pursuit of knowledge. Envoys and diplomats journeyed to forge alliances, negotiate treaties, and gather intelligence. Their travels, while sometimes affording better provisions and greater security than those of merchants or pilgrims, were nonetheless fraught with the complexities of international relations and the ever present danger of falling afoul of political intrigue. Scholars and students, though perhaps a smaller contingent, also traveled to learn from renowned masters, to access rare manuscripts, and to broaden their intellectual horizons. The pursuit of knowledge, like the pursuit of salvation or profit, could be a powerful, albeit less common, catalyst for leaving the familiar behind. Yet, to romanticize these journeys would be a profound disservice to the harsh realities faced by medieval travelers. While the motivations were varied and often compelling, the experience itself was rarely, if ever, described as enjoyable. The romantic ideal of the adventurous traveler, reveling in the discovery of new lands and cultures, is largely a construct of later eras. For the vast majority who embarked on these journeys, the memories would be etched not with delight, but with a deep and abiding sense of relief upon their eventual and often hard won return. Imagine the collective exhale of thousands upon thousands of weary souls, finally back within the comforting embrace of their own villages, their familiar routines, and their well worn hearths. The allure of distant lands, the promises of wealth, spiritual merit, or strategic advantage would have been irrevocably dulled, perhaps even extinguished, by the visceral memory of the journey itself. The stench of crowded, unsanitary accommodations, the taste of meager and often spoiled rations, the constant anxieties about safety. These were not mere inconveniences, but defining characteristics of medieval travel. The sheer physical toll, the relentless fatigue, the vulnerability to the elements, and the ever present threat of violence or disease would have left an indelible mark, a potent deterrent against ever repeating such an ordeal. Consider the merchant whose caravan was ambushed, losing half his goods and narrowly escaping with his life. His tales of the journey would be filled not with the thrill of the open road, but with the terror of the unseen enemy, the desperate flight, and the gnawing fear of poverty that followed. Would he, with such memories seared into his consciousness, eagerly plan another venture to the same distant markets? It is far more likely that he would seek alternative, perhaps less lucrative, but significantly safer means of sustenance, or perhaps invest in local trade, his adventurous spirit thoroughly quashed by the brutal encounter. His preference would be to remain firmly planted on familiar soil, the memory of the road a bitter testament to his near undoing. Or picture the pilgrim who, after months of arduous trekking, finally reaches their hallowed destination, only to find it overrun by opportunistic charlatans, rife with disease, and far from the serene spiritual sanctuary they had envisioned. The physical suffering endured, the crippling blisters, the aching joints, the gnawing hunger, the relentless exposure to the elements would be amplified by the disappointment, the sense that their immense sacrifice had yielded little beyond physical and emotional exhaustion. The return journey, if undertaken at all, would be a grim, determined trudge, the sole focus being the swift re-establishment of their previous life. The memory of the journey would serve not as a badge of honor, but as a stark warning, a visceral reminder of the arduous path they had traversed and the questionable rewards it had yielded. The desire to revisit such an experience would likely be as faint as the scent of incense in a plague-ridden church. Even those undertaking journeys of duty, like the soldier returning from a protracted campaign, would likely view their travels with a mixture of grim satisfaction at survival and profound relief at no longer being subjected to the rigmarole of military life. The camaraderie forged on the road might be a treasured memory, but it would be interwoven with the recollections of cold nights spent sleeping on hard ground, the gnawing uncertainty of the next meal, and the ever-present specter of death. The campaign might have ended, but the arduous transit to and from the theater of operations would have been an ordeal in itself. The prospect of undertaking a similar journey, even for a different cause, would be met with a weary resignation, a deep-seated desire to remain within the predictable confines of home. The very fabric of medieval society was built upon a foundation of localized existence. Most people were born, lived, and died within a few miles of their birthplace. The world beyond their immediate vicinity was a realm of rumor, of tales told by the rare traveler, of abstract notions gleaned from sermons or the rare illuminated manuscript. The vast majority of the population had little, if any, personal experience with the wider world. Their journeys, if they undertook any at all, were typically short, local affairs to the nearest market town, to a neighboring village for a wedding, or perhaps to a local shrine. These were not the epic sojourns that occupy the pages of historical chronicles. The journeys that were chronicled, the ones that involved extensive travel across continents, were undertaken by a relatively small, privileged, or exceptionally determined segment of the population. These were the merchants seeking fortunes, the knights eager for glory, the monks driven by piety, and the nobles fulfilling feudal obligations. For them, the investment of time, resources, and significant personal hardship was deemed worthwhile, or perhaps simply unavoidable, in pursuit of their specific goals. However, for the vast majority, the abstract benefits of distant travel were simply insufficient to outweigh the concrete miseries. The common farmer, the village craftsman, the ordinary villager. Their lives were centered on the immediate, the tangible, the familiar. The seasonal cycles of agriculture, the rhythms of local community life, the security of their own hearth, these were the anchors that held them firmly in place. The idea of leaving all of this behind for an extended period to face unknown dangers and endure unimaginable discomforts would have seemed not only foolish, but utterly alien. The memory of a medieval journey was not one of joyous adventure or picturesque vistas. It was a memory painted in shades of exhaustion, fear, and deprivation. It was the memory of the relentless ache in one's bones, the gnawing emptiness in one's stomach, the chilling dampness that seeped into one's very being, and the constant, low grade terror of what lurked beyond the next bend in the road or the next shadowy forest. It was the memory of the coarse wool scratching against raw skin, the acrid smell of unwashed bodies and stale ale, the cacophony of unfamiliar languages, and the unsettling silence of unknown territories. The stories that circulated were not sanitized travelogues. They were cautionary tales, whispered around firesides, recounting tales of caravans lost to blizzards, ships dashed against rocks, travelers fallen prey to robbers or treacherous guides, and entire communities ravaged by outbreaks of disease that had traveled along the very routes people were now contemplating. These narratives, filled with the raw, unvarnished truth of the perils involved, served as powerful deterrents. Why tempt fate when a perfectly adequate, if perhaps less exciting, life could be lived within the safety and familiarity of one's own village? The concept of wanderlust, as we understand it today, was a foreign notion. The drive to explore, to see the world for its own sake, was largely absent from the collective consciousness of medieval society. Travel was a means to an end, a necessity dictated by external forces rather than an intrinsic desire. When the end was achieved, or when the forces compelling the journey ceased, the overwhelming impulse was to return to the known, the safe, and the comfortable. Therefore, the question, why repeat, becomes almost rhetorical when viewed through the lens of the typical medieval traveler's experience. For most, the initial journey was an ordeal, a trial to be endured, and then, if possible, forgotten. The collective memory of these arduous sojourns would have served as a powerful disincentive. The tales of woe, the descriptions of hardship, the sheer visceral unpleasantness of the experience, these would have far outweighed any abstract notions of adventure or discovery. The shared understanding was that the world beyond one's immediate surroundings was a place of great difficulty and danger, and that the rewards, while sometimes tangible, rarely justified the immense cost and suffering. The deepest sigh of relief, therefore, would have been reserved not for the return to adventure, but for the return to peace, to familiarity, and to the simple, profound comfort of being home. The echoes of those errant journeys would not inspire more, but rather serve as a potent reminder of the wisdom of staying put, of cherishing the known, and of leaving the wider, more perilous world to those whose destinies or desperation compelled them to tread its unforgiving paths.